Where is Leovanus? Demanded the Gat of Blerontis, chief quantity surveyor of the entire northeastern gas district of the planet of Blerontin. No, I do not want another bloody fish paste sandwich. He did not exactly use the word bloody, because it did not exist in the Blerontin language. The word he used could be more literally translated as similar in size to the left earlobe, but the meaning was much closer to bloody. Nor did he actually use the phrase fish paste, since fish do not exist on Blerontin in the form in which we would understand them to be fish. But when one is translating from a language used by a civilization of which we know nothing, located as far away as the center of the galaxy, one has to be approximate. Similarly, the Gat of Blerontis was not exactly a quantity surveyor, and certainly the term Northeastern Gas District gives no idea at all about the magnificence and grandeur of his position. Look, perhaps I'd better start again. Where is Leovanus? No idea at all about the most important and significant statesman on the entire planet of Blerontin. The launch cannot proceed without him. Several minor officials were dispatched to search for the great man. Meanwhile, the vast crowd simmered with mounting impatience in front of the Grand Assembly Dock, where the new starship stood, veiled in its attractive pink silk sheeting. Not one member of the crowd had glimpsed even so much as a nut or a bolt of the ship, but already its fame had swept the galaxy from spiral arm to spiral arm. Back on the launch podium, the great Leovanus had still not been sighted. A minor official was explaining yet again to the Gat of Blerontis why the fish paste sandwiches were essential.
Normally, your stupendous and most lofty magnificence, you would be quite right in supposing that the mere launch of a starship would not be marked by such distinguished observances. But, as you are aware, this starship is different. This starship is the greatest, most gorgeous, most technologically advanced starship ever built. This is the ultimate starship, the greatest cybernautic achievement of this or any other age, and it is utterly indestructible. The Intergalactic Council, therefore, thought it suitable to declare it a fish paste sandwich event.
The Blerontins insist on serving so-called fish paste sandwiches during festivals and important book launches, despite the fact that all Blerontins find them disgusting. It is a tradition that dates back to a time when Blerontin was an impoverished planet, living on the edge of starvation. Having run out of every other kind of food, the Blerontin team were reluctantly forced to offer up fish paste sandwiches as their entry for the Centennial Intergalactic Canapés Championship. For some unaccountable reason, the fish paste appealed to the jaded palates of the judges, clinched the championship for Blerontin, and paved the way for Blerontinian domination of the entire galactic centre for eons to come. The Gat's heart sank. His last line of defence shrivelled before his eyes, and he knew he was condemned to eat at least one fish paste canopy before the launch was over. The taste, he knew, would endure for months, and a Blerontin month was equivalent to several lifetimes if you happened to come from Earth, which of course nobody there did. In fact, nobody in that entire throng of some 50 million Blerontinians who had turned up to see the launch of the greatest starship in the history of the universe had ever even heard of Earth. And if you'd asked them, they wouldn't have been able to understand you, because translation blisters were not allowed to be worn on a fish paste event. It was another of those stupid little traditions that made the Gat furious. And still Leovanus did not appear. "Everyone here is holding their breath and keeping their fingers crossed," whispered the head reporter of the Blerontin News-Gathering Bureau into his invisible microphone. "No one has yet even caught so much as a glimpse of the fabulous starship, but everyone is certain that it will not only be the most technologically advanced, but also the most beautiful starship ever to have been created. It is, after all, the brainchild of Leovanus, to whose architectural genius we owe the great North-South Bridge that now links our two polar caps, to whose musical inspiration we owe the Blerontin national anthem, Our Canapés Triumph Daily, and to whose unsurpassable mastery of ballistics and biomass energetics we owe our third sun that now shines above us with its own famous on-off switch. But there's news just coming in that... What's that? Ladies and gentlemen and things, it appears that the great Leovanus has gone missing. Nobody has seen him all day. Surely they can't start the launch without him, but the crowd are beginning to demand some action, and... what's that? A sour note had swept through the crowd as a band of short individuals, dressed in ragged overalls and flat caps, suddenly forced their way into the spectators' area. They were shouting in a language no one could understand because of the ban on translator blisters, and they were brandishing indecipherable placards. It looks as if the Yassigan delegation has managed to gain entry. An edge of alarm had entered the head reporter's voice. This was mainly because he had his entire commentary written down in advance, as he always did. The thought that an unforeseen turn of events might now force him to look at what was actually going on, and then improvise, was a nightmare that had dogged his sleep for all the years that he had been in the reporting business. Said the head reporter. He felt his head going light. He fought for breath as he felt his bowels starting to move. No, what can I say? He was praying that the words would come to him. In his recurring nightmare, the one that he always had after eating Snork's chitterlings, he was in this very situation. Something unforeseen had occurred. His script was whisked away by some unseen hand, and the words never came. It has to be explained in defense of the head reporter that unforeseen events seldom occurred during public events on Blorontin, owing to the fact that the authorities exerted a pretty tight control over these things. "It's coming just out who?" exclaimed the head reporter. At that moment, an unseen hand whisked away his script, and the head reporter felt a warm sensation all over his lower abdomen. "I've done it! I mean, it's definitely Yaskans! I can see them now!" That was practically 2 whole sentences. He could do it! "They've purpley pitch burps! Oh, damn!" It was one thing not to be able to think of anything, but how could he possibly come out with utter nonsense? That hadn't been in his nightmare. It was worse. The truth is that this personal disaster for the head reporter was just one in a string of disasters that had dogged the building of the Starship. There had been rumours of corners cut. The Cybernet pigeon cursors had been below spec. The great engine had been mislaid. Leovinus himself had quarrelled with the chairman of Starstruct, Inc. There had been arguments between Leovinus and his manager, Brabostigan. There had been quarrels between Brabostigan and Leovinus's accountant, Scraliontis. There had been arguments between Scraliontis and Leovinus, and so on and so on. The fact of the matter was that the construction of the Starship had brought financial ruin on almost everybody involved, including one entire planet. Yassica had been, hitherto, a flourishing resort of industrious folk, with the most efficient and dependable construction industry in the central galaxy. Yassicans had enjoyed centuries of quiet prosperity and a high reputation. They never overcharged, they always delivered on time, they never cut corners. They were a race of proud craftsmen who had nothing to do with intergalactic canapes competitions, and thus were able to devote their wealth to the well-being of their own people. That was, until they undertook the construction of Leovinus's masterpiece, crowning achievement of his career, the Starship that even now stands hidden from sight in its launching bay, awaiting the unveiling ceremony. "Give us back our happy lifestyle!" shout the Yassican demonstrators unintelligibly to the Bloantinian onlookers. "Planets, not starships!" roar their placards to the baffled crowd. "Get those bastards out of there!" growls Flortin Rimanquez, the chief of police and rabbits. "Where is Leovinus?" groans the Gat of Blorontis. Could it be only the day before that Leovinus had held his press conference? He had felt so powerfully complacent as he stepped up onto the platform. His white beard had been specially groomed by Feronis Feronisis, the greatest hairdresser on Blorontin, and his eyebrows had been stuck back on with a new toupee tape that was guaranteed absolutely undetectable. In many ways, this was the greatest moment in his life. "What is it like to be not only the greatest architect the galaxy has ever known, but also the greatest sculptor, the greatest mathematical genius, as well as a world-class garnisher and canapes arranger?" Exactly the kind of question Leovinus enjoyed. There had been times in his younger days when he might have retorted, "Go lick someone else's ass, hack, I'm only interested in truth and beauty." But somehow he found that the more wrinkles he counted on his forehead, and the more problems he had with his continence and his 7 times table, the more he found a little flattery most welcome. "I loved your Pandax building with the interchangeable rooms and total reassembly potential," shouted a young cub reporter with soft eyes and a delightful cleavage. Thank you. Leovinus beamed in his most venerable and yet at the same time approachable manner. You look terrific, shouted another. Leovinus was just trying to decide which of the two cub reporters with soft eyes and delightful cleavages he should ask backstage for a little drink, or whether he should invite them both and then see how things worked out, when a male voice cut across. Exactly what was the scientific experiment you were working on when you had your recent accident, sir? And is it true that your eyebrows have still not grown back? Leovinus fought off a panic attack and told himself his eyebrows looked perfectly okay. This hard-boiled journalist was merely trying to wind him up. Then he had to fight off a panic attack about the fact that he just had a panic attack. It's perfectly normal to get panic attacks at my age, he told himself severely. At the same time, he noted, thankfully, the ripple of embarrassment that had swept through the assembled media. I'm lucky I don't have angina and a sagging bottom at my age. Leovinus always counted his blessings. But something had definitely gone wrong with the press conference. A journalist from the back was asking a question in a tone of voice that didn't sound in the least bit ingratiating. In fact, there was something so uningratiating about the inflection of the voice that Leovinus could barely understand what was being said. I said, repeated the journalist in that same uncajoling voice, how do you answer the allegations that corners have been cut on the construction of the Starship, and that there have been financial improprieties involving your manager, Antar Probostigan, and your accountant, Brute Squaliontis? Such insinuations, replied Leovinus, forming his touped eyebrows into the most formidable frown, and drawing his shoulders back into what he knew was his most dignified and intimidating posture, are beneath contempt. Mr. Probostigan is a man of unblemished reputation, and has the highest regard for correct procedure. Brute Squaliontis has been my accountant for the last 30 years, and has been unimpeachable throughout that time. He could feel one of his eyebrows starting to come loose. Funny that. He always imagined that as he got older and more confident, he would stop sweating whenever he had to tell a barefaced lie, but he still did. But isn't it true that the standard of workmanship on the Starship has dropped since the building was moved from Yessica to Blerontin? Absolute poop, declared the great genius in his best "How dare you waste the time of a great genius like me" voice, which he had been practicing recently and now had down to a T. I am personally checking the standards of craftsmanship on every facet of the ship, and I can guarantee that standards have, if anything, gone up since the transferal to Blerontin. He felt his other eyebrow pop loose from his forehead. What do you say about the collapse of the Yassican economy, Mr. Leovinus? It was the same dreadful journalist going on. Why couldn't someone ask him whether he preferred architecture to quantum physics, or whether he felt painting should be considered a higher art form than canapé arrangement? Those were the kind of questions he was a whiz at dealing with these days. Do you feel personally responsible at all for the present sufferings of the Yassican peoples? Leovinus went for the last goalkeeper at the net defence. I should explain that Blerontin football is played with anything up to 6 balls, and consequently a large number of goalkeepers is sometimes allowed. I am an artist, Mr. Journalist, he said, with that voice of his that made grown men cringe behind their stomachs, and young cub reporters with delightful cleavages feel deliciously damp all over. Of course, I deeply regret the terrible destruction of an entire culture that their economic mismanagement has brought upon themselves, and I hereby offer to the people of Yessica. He is to my art, and I would be betraying the sacred trust of my genius were I to compromise my vision for the sake of fiscal expediency. Ooh, breathed one of the cub reporters, and shifted onto her other buttock. But Leovinus scarcely noticed her. He was too preoccupied by the feeling that the entire press conference had spiralled out of control. Indeed, it now seemed to be plunging towards some catastrophic conclusion that he must at all costs avoid, even if it meant foregoing a delightful drink with the delightful cub reporters, who were even now gazing at him with increasingly delightful eyes and increasingly delightful cleavages. In any case, he knew how any such assignation would end. He would soon find their smiles begin to grate, their soft gazes would become tiresome, probing arc lights of banality, and he would flee from the two young reporters in despair and disappointment. That was what always happened. For deep down inside him, Leovinus knew that no one was good enough for him. Why go through it all again? Leovinus rose unsteadily to his feet. "Thank you," he said. And then he was gone. The greatest genius of his age, gone, without even so much as a nod in the cub reporter's direction. It was hardly to be believed. Despite his age, brilliance, and genius, Leovinus was not always a sensible individual. He had passions. Passions that would rise up the inside of his being and take over his magnificent brain like cholera takes over a city. And not all these passions revolved around cub reporters. At the present, his one overriding passion was the starship. That magnificent creation, that crowning glory of his life's work. Ever since his recent accident, Leovinus had been reluctant to go abroad, partly because his joints had stiffened up somewhat, and partly because he didn't want to be seen without his eyebrows. Leovinus was not without personal vanity. He had therefore got into the habit of supervising the construction of his starship by virtual reality and telepresence, both brought to such a pitch of perfection by Blerontinian scientists that it was sometimes hard to remember which was the real thing, particularly if you were getting on a bit and your mind was on cleavages. For that is what Leovinus's mind had been preoccupied with for many months now, but not the cleavages of the young cub reporters. No, Leovinus's obsession was the cleavage of data streams as they separated out into random thought fields, the cleavage of neuroconnectors as they bifurcated into the memory bank and the sensation retrieval system, the cleavage of separators and transjoiners linking and distinguishing those two vital processes, thought and feeling. His obsession was the heart of his starship. He called her Titania. Titania was the heart, the mind, the spirit, the soul of the ship. A massive cyber-intelligence system was required to run the ship, of course. But, as we now know, intelligence devoid of emotion is non-functional. However smart a robot or computer may be, it can only do exactly what you tell it to do and then stop. To keep thinking, it has to want to. It has to be motivated. You can't think if you can't feel. So the ship's intelligence had to be imbued with emotions, with personality. And its name was Titania. The starship was Leovinus's creation. So was Titania. It had suited Leovinus, while he concentrated on this vital heart of the ship, to work from home. But now he suddenly realized that he hadn't actually been on the ship itself for, well, he really didn't know how long. Thus it was that night, after the press conference, the great man put on a long snork-hair coat and made his way towards the assembly dock, where his masterpiece stood, awaiting tomorrow's launch. Earlier, he had received telecalls from the project manager, Antar Bobostigan, and the chief accountant, Droots Squaliontis. They had both been so full of gratitude for his defence of them during the press conference, and so reassuring about the prospects of the launch, that Leovinus found a vein in his right thigh beginning to twitch, and he kept thinking of the phrase parrot droppings without any viable context. He slipped unseen down the service entrance, and waited in the shadows until he saw the security robot stop to take its scheduled rest break, as laid down by Blerontin law. He then hurried across the open forecourt and disappeared into the shadow of the temporary construction workers' sheds. It was not as if he didn't have a perfect right to be there. It was just he wanted to do this without the usual fanfare and the welcoming party and the official guided tour and all the usual commotion that accompanied his public visits. He wanted to commune with his creation alone. He looked up. There was the assembly dock, looming up into the night sky far, far above him. It stretched a good mile up, and the starship, his baby, stuck up another half-mile above that, ready for blast-off at midday tomorrow, precisely. The silk coverings flapped in the breeze that swept across the observation arena, over the administration buildings and around the dock structures. Leovinus felt a surge of emotion sweep through his body and engulf his magnificent brain. His heart missed several beats. His knees turned to jelly. But it was not his pride in that stupendous structure that gave him butterflies in the tummy, nor was it the exultation that, after all these years, it was finally complete that made him feel like a schoolboy on his first date. No, what made his hand shake as he sleeked it through his greying locks was the thought that in there, in those vast halls and staterooms, Titania was waiting for him. As Leovinus leaned towards the starship, the wind picked up, blasting dead leaves, old snack wrappings, torn religious journals, pages of sentimental verse, knitting patterns, and all the other usual detritus left behind by construction workers across the servicing area. The sheeting that covered the starship flapped frantically like the great ghoul in the ancient filmed entertainment, The Great Ghoul Frightens a Lot of Folk. Leovinus shuddered with a childhood memory of fear. Then he shuddered again, as he suddenly saw a figure slip from the base of the launching gantry into the shadows opposite the main steps of the starship. The moment he saw that figure, he knew deep in his bones, with that certainty that comes of being absolutely without any doubt whatsoever, that everything was about to go terribly, fearfully wrong. Cautiously, he edged round into the shadows where he had seen the figure disappear. So, a dreadful voice spoke to him out of the darkness. It was a voice that made his stomach relocate itself around his knees, a voice that made him want to be sick, to be anywhere but where he was. Leovinus looked around for a means of escape, but it was too late. Last-minute checkups, eh? The figure stepped out of the shadow and confronted him. It was that dreadful journalist from the press conference. "Haven't you tormented me enough? Haven't you already ruined the day that was meant to be one of the greatest days in my life?" That's what Leovinus wanted to say, but he merely mumbled, "Oh, it's you." "Are you afraid something's going to go wrong with the launch?" "No, of course not." Leovinus adopted just the right cold tone that gave nothing away. "I've merely come to pay my regards." He liked to be thought of as a bit of a sentimentalist, as well as a great brain. "But come on, you must be a bit worried. Everyone knows that the workmanship here on Bloontin has not been a patch on the Yassicans. In fact, you know, and I know, Bloontin craftsmanship is nowhere near good enough to finish a ship of this sophistication. Just because the Bloontin government chooses to employ the Amalgamated Unmarried Teenage Mothers construction units, there is no reason to think that the work is in any way slipshod," retorted old Leovinus. "I have every confidence in their work." "I don't believe you," replied the journalist. "Very well, I'll show you." The great man saw his private tete-a-tete with Titania being blown away on the wind that now buffeted them, as a small unlit work platform carried them up one of the service gantries that surrounded the great starship. It was only when you started getting this high up, thought the journalist, that you really began to appreciate the full scale of the enterprise. The launch area below receded into darkness and silence, as they rattled their way up the side of the vast starship, higher and higher, until the great keel broadened out, and they reached the main body of the ship. A short walk across another gantry, and they were at the main doors of the spacecraft. An entry coder read Leovinus's fingerprint, and cross-checked it with a blood sample, recent hair loss estimate, and a favourite recreational activity. The doors slid open, and the two entered. The journalist had, of course, often been in starships, but he had never been in a starship like this. It was magnificent, astonishing. It was built with luxury star travel in mind. It was built to last. It was built to impress. What's more, it was still being built. Two workmen were slipping into the service elevator as Leovinus and the journalist entered the embarkation lobby. "Oh, just some last-minute adjustments," one of them mumbled to Leovinus, and they were gone. Said Leovinus, in a way that the journalist freely translated as, "I wonder what those two could have been up to. They surely can't still be making adjustments this near to launch, and why didn't I know about them? I'd better check everything." It was, you understand, a very free translation. "Donkey databases!" exclaimed the greatest living genius in the galaxy. "Look at that!" The journalist looked. He saw a smartly dressed robot wearing headphones and standing on the polished marble floor of one of the most elegant rooms he had ever been in. The design was typical late Leovinus, and yet it was imbued with a spirit that was new. It had a lightness that some critics had thought lacking in much of his earlier work, and the colours were vibrant and yet warm and welcoming. Perhaps Leovinus had at last got in touch with the feminine side of his nature, or perhaps the gentler, more approachable feel of the starship's interior owed something to the many little finishing touches introduced by Titania. The journalist was at a loss to see why the great man was so angry, but Leovinus was already striding across to the far wall. There he yanked at a decorative panel. "Upside down," he yelled. I sometimes think I have to build the entire ship with my own hands." and he produced a screwdriver and proceeded to replace the panel in the correct position. "Can't they see the entire ambient structure of the room is destroyed by exactly that sort of inattention to detail?" The journalist made a note in his thumb recorder. "Welcome to the Starship Titanic." The smart robot was now addressing a light fitting that protruded from the wall. "Allow me to show you the facilities available to second-class travellers." The thing then turned smartly on its heels and walked straight into the nearest closed door. There was a clang and the robot fell backwards onto the highly decorative marble floor. "Here you will see the Grand Axial Canal, second class." The robot proudly extended a white-gloved hand at the ceiling. The journalist made another note in his thumb recorder. The effect of the robot's minor mishap on Leovinus was also noted down in the journalist's thumb recorder. It started off as blank disbelief and ended up as cold fury. In between, it went through a fascinating range of adjustments, all of which were noted down by the journalist. Surprised dissatisfaction was rapidly replaced by stupefied indignation, which in turn quickly became bitter resentment, which equally quickly was transformed into burning thirst for vengeance, and so to cold fury. "Brabostigan," murmured the great man. "That bastard has been skimping on the synthoneurons." The journalist made another note, but Leovinus turned on him so suddenly that he stuck his thumb into his mouth and pretended to be sucking at it. "This can't happen on this ship," explained Leovinus as he picked up the fallen robot. "Every Doorbot has a fail-safe neuron embedded in its circuitry that cancels out any non-rational activity, such as we just witnessed. They are expensive items, but I think you will agree, well worth the money." The journalist nodded and pretended that he had a splinter in the end of his thumb. "Except that bastard Brabostigan has obviously left them out. When I see him, I'll—" But Leovinus was stopped in mid-sentence. "He's probably wondering what else is wrong with the ship," thought the journalist with mounting excitement. He could feel a story materializing in front of him, a big story, a humongous story, and the great thing was he wouldn't have to do anything. It was all going to unfold in front of him. He knew it. And sure enough, before the journalist could pretend to find the non-existent splinter, Leovinus had given the doorbot a quick adjustment, the door had been opened, and the great man had been bowed through into the corridor beyond. "Enjoy your honeymoon, you lucky couple," called the doorbot cheerfully. The journalist noted this down and hurried after the great architect and shipbuilder, who had just turned right into one of the most astounding architectural spaces the journalist had ever entered. It was an oval space marked out by columns. Around the perimeter wall was painted a frieze depicting the favourite recreational pastime of the founding fathers of Blerontin, which was posing for frieze painters. Leovinus was standing staring up at a huge statue of a winged female that stood at the other end. But the journalist's eye went down, down and down into what seemed like an infinity of descent, for there at his feet was the great central well that occupied the gigantic keel of the starship. It was the spine of the ship, and around it, like nerve impulses, illuminated elevators constantly went up and down, servicing the living quarters that were stacked below them, tier after tier. At the very bottom, far, far down below near the bilges of the ship, the supergalactic traveller deluxe suites. Above them, the second-class executive duplexes. And above them, far above them, the fabulously appointed first-class staterooms. But the journalist scarcely had time to take all this in, for Leovinus was off, striding through the many-columned hall towards the far vestibule, through which he disappeared. By the time the journalist had caught up with him, Leovinus was standing on the jetty of an even more extraordinary and beautiful feature of the starship Titanic, the Grand Axial Canal, second class. From the central well of the starship ran two great canals, one to the fore and one to the aft. These partly had the effect of cooling the engines, but they were also elegant recreational facilities. Up and down the canal, gondolas plied their way, the automated gondoliers all singing their own personal selection of Blerontinian folk songs, but particularly the one about the beautiful young female acrobat who fell in love with a gondolier and gave him 6 Penades, approximately £1 million sterling, as a tip. Leovinus was doing his from blank disbelief to cold fury routine again. The journalist took note. "They are not supposed to sing unless they've got passengers." Leovinus seemed to be choking as he clambered down into the nearest waiting gondola. The singing immediately stopped. The journalist joined him and said, perhaps they're doing a test, reversing everything. It was the only thing he could think of that was in any way cheery. "Oh, don't talk pigeon poop," snapped Leovinus. He was clearly in no mood to be cheered. "Promenade deck elevator." "See, house proud and the religious mother of twins," said the automated gondolier. Leovinus flinched and felt the vein twitching in his thigh. Leovinus allowed the irritation to mount within himself as he straightened one of the priceless, no-art masterpieces that decorated the elevator lobby. "Good day to you, sir, madam, or thing, and how may we assist you in your vertical transportation requirements today?" The lift bot was half embedded in the wall of the lift. Its free hand hovered eagerly by the lever that came out of its chest. "Just to the promenade deck, and no back chat," snapped Leovinus. He sometimes regretted the characters that these robots seemed to acquire, but there it was. If the ship's intelligence were to be allowed emotions, and certainly no one could doubt that Titania had strong emotions, then you had to allow her to choose robot characters she got on with. It was no good forcing the issue, although Leovinus had on occasions spoken to Titania quite forcibly about some of the characters with whom she surrounded herself. But then Titania was so tolerant, so understanding of people's failings and mistakes, that she could get on with practically anybody. He had made her like that. The giant promenade deck was Leovinus's particular little favourite. Under its vast, transparent canopy, passengers could stroll and marvel at the mind-erupting brilliance of the galaxy through which they were passing. The Vari-Spex composition glass, of which the canopy was made, had the effect of intensifying the radiant brightness of the stars, while at the same time making it possible for the observer, by a mere twist of the head, to see in the detail of a powerful telescope any particular star that caught his, her, or its fancy. Around the perimeter, the Pellerator, a sort of horizontal lift of Leovinus's design, enabled the less active travellers to tour the deck without stirring an unnecessary muscle. That was the theory. That was what Leovinus had viewed with great complacency on his telepresence and in his virtual reality viewer at home. But that was not what he now saw in front of him. Real reality was different. What he now saw was what is referred to architecturally as a shambles. The vast glass canopy stretched above, as it should, displaying the immense stretches of pink silk sheeting which covered the ship. But below all was confusion. The beautiful polished parquet floor was approximately 1/10 beautiful polished parquet floor. The rest was exposed girders and cablework, gaping holes and protruding wires. Where the large sprawling brasserie for second-class passengers should have sprawled, there was only a large, sprawling empty space littered with builder's rubble and polystyrene cups. How could this be? They didn't even use polystyrene cups on Blorontin, and yet there they were. There was no disguising the ghastly, unthinkable fact that the promenade deck was not finished, nor likely to be before the launch tomorrow morning. The journalist turned to see that Leovinus had fallen to his knees. He suddenly looked like the old man that he was. The swagger and gallantry that usually marked his public appearances seemed to have been sucked out of him, leaving him like a crumpled, empty bag. "It can't be true," he was mumbling into his beard. "Even Probosticon, even Scraliontis couldn't lie so. I mean, only this morning they told me it was all." "Good morning, sir. Would you like your nasal haircut?" A doorbot had suddenly activated itself and was apparently trying to usher them into a cement mixer. Leovinus cracked at last. "Bastards!" he screamed at the flapping silk sheets beyond the canopy. "Bastards!" he yelled at the unfinished works. Suddenly a movement behind one of the pillars caught his eye. Taking the journalist totally by surprise, Leovinus seemed to regain all his vitality in an instant, and had sprinted across the parquet flooring and pounced behind the pillar. A solitary worker in drab overalls was crouching down, trying to lose himself in a crevice of the unfinished floor. "What the devil are you doing here?" screamed Leovinus. The worker stood up shiftily and pretended to be adjusting a loose end of wire. "Just making good," he said. "Making good?" yelled Leovinus. "You call this good?" He threw his arm out towards the vast, unfinished reaches of the promenade deck. "We launch the ship tomorrow, and there's months more work to do here." "Yeah, it's been a bit slow." The worker was edging towards the sleek stainless steel lift that offered him his only means of escape from this elderly lunatic. "What were you doing just now?" demanded the elderly lunatic. "Me? Just now?" replied the worker. "Yes, I saw you doing something." "Me? No, I wouldn't do nothing. I only came to collect my parrot." The words fell out of his mouth and seemed to freeze in the air, and then, like lumps of solid ice, they hit Leovinus, one after the other, and he reeled from their impact. "Parrot?" he said. "Parrot? What parrot?" It's just a parrot, a couple of wings, that sort, "What is a parrot doing on board my beautiful ship?" demanded the outraged genius. "Why have I never seen this parrot? Why didn't this blasted parrot ask my permission to come on board?" "Oh, there's the lift," said the worker. And the next moment he was in it with the journalist hard on his heels. The door closed and they were both dropping to the lower floors. "A parrot on my starship? What the hell has been going on?" Suddenly the great, the magnificent, the envied Leovinus was hunched up in a corner, weeping over a statue of a winged female. "Titania," he was sobbing. "Titania, what has happened? What shall we do?" Titania. The genius of Leovinus was nowhere so evident as in this, his last and best-loved creation. Titania was the brains of the ship, and her statue appeared everywhere on board, serving as the eyes and ears and communicating essence of the ship's intelligence. But, as was mentioned before, the ship's intelligence had to be imbued with emotional life as well. And this is where Leovinus had excelled himself. Titania was not only the brains, but also the heart of the ship. Titania's emotional intelligence had to be carefully crafted to match her task. To run a gigantic ship of such bewildering complexity, to manage its crew, and to look after an enormous complement of passengers of different races, species, mentalities, and bodily functions, and to make them all feel happy, safe, and cared for, required that Titania be hugely intelligent, kind, wise, caring, serene, warm. And she was all these things. Like her image, all those giant brooding angels in every room on every deck, Titania's spirit should also have been imbuing the entire ship. Quite clearly it wasn't.
Antar Babostigan, please.
Leovinus spat the name into the phone. "I'm afraid Mr. Babostigan is not here. Would you like to speak to Mrs. Babostigan?" Leovinus had always felt secretly sorry for the project manager's wife. He could not imagine what it must be like living with such a duplicitous, cold-blooded egomaniac as Antar Babostigan. His pity was only slightly modified by the knowledge that Crosser Babostigan herself was, if anything, marginally more duplicitous, cold-blooded, and egoistical. Perhaps the two cancelled each other out, and the Babostigans lived a warm, intimate, and caring family life. It was a mystery to the great inventor.
"So nice to hear from you, Leo," said Crosser Babostigan.
Leovinus hated it when people called him that, and he knew that she knew he knew she knew it.
"How is the family?"
"I don't have any family, Crosser," said Leovinus, with what he hoped she could hear was strained patience.
"Where is Antar?"
"I think, in fact, I'm sure he's at the ship. He went there with Drood a couple of hours ago. Some panic about something or other. You know how those guys worry themselves sick over your ship?"
Yes, he knew. About the same way an anaconda does over a goat it's just eaten.
"Is there somewhere they can reach you when they get back?"
Leovinus flicked the phone off. A deep sense of foreboding spread from his thighs up to his abdomen and across his chest into his heart. Babostigan and Scraliontis on the ship? What the devil are they up to? The deep sense of foreboding suddenly changed into a sharp stabbing pain in his stomach. He felt cold. He felt sick. He had to talk to the only person that could help. Titania. He made his way down onto the canal level, along the Grand Axial Canal itself, second class, towards the central dome.
When he reached the vast statue of Titania that dominated the central dome and the head of the central well, he disappeared into a doorway under one of her wings. A long staircase led up to the vital heart of the ship, the secret chamber of Titania herself. Leovinus had long enjoyed his reputation as the originator of ironic architecture. There was the famous house he designed for Gardis Arbaldonta, the professor of mathematical implausibilities at Blerontis University, in which the doors were actually radio sets and entrance and egress was gained via the bath. But here on the starship, he believed he had constructed one of his most satisfying constructional ironies. Titania's secret chamber, her central intelligence core, was located in the very middle of the great central dome. It formed the giant chandelier that hung above the central well. The secret heart of the ship was hidden in full view of every passenger and every member of the crew. The chamber itself hung upside down, but it had been surrounded by an inverted gravity field so that, when you entered it, it appeared to be the right way up. The serrated ribs that traversed the great dome were, once you had entered the inversion field and submitted to the disorienting process of gravity reversal, in fact, long upside-down staircases leading up to the chamber, and the great dome itself was a vast concave floor at the bottom of the immense central well that stretched up above topsy-turvy in an arrangement that bewildered and astonished the first-time visitor. Leovinus sprinted up the staircase 2 steps at a time. His mind focused on one thought: Titania, the love of his old age, the obsession of his aging heart. Intelligent, kind, wise, caring, serene, warm. Titania. He burst into the secret chamber and gasped. His head went into a spin, and when you have a mind the size of Leovinus's, a spinning head is a formidable sensation. He vomited. He could scarcely bring himself to look at the horror before him, and yet he could not take his eyes off it. Titania, his darling creation, his joy, had been dismembered. She lay there in the centre of the chamber, her hair and wings spread out in their perfect circle around her. But her beautiful, gracious head was grotesquely disfigured. Her mouth had been ripped away, her eyes gouged out, and her nose torn off, leaving a gaping cavity of raw microcircuitry. But before he could even so much as mutter the word fiends, Leovinus became aware of someone else in the room. A figure was crouching behind the succubus console.
Bostigan!
Leovinus ground the word out like a piece of gristle.
What in the name of darkness are you playing at?
Without thinking, Leovinus found himself lunging at the project manager. A small, glowing silver shard fell from Bobostigan's grasp and tinkled to the floor. Leovinus glanced down and realized that one of Titania's incredibly delicate cerebral arteries, the central intelligence core of Titania's brain, was lying against his foot.
You're destroying her!
Bobostigan pushed Leovinus off him, and the old man staggered back and fell onto the floor, across the outspread wings of his beloved creature.
You're blind, Leovinus. You sit up there in your ivory tower, thinking you're too high-minded and pure to deal with grubby things like business and finance. Well, this whole thing's gone way out of control, thanks to you.
What do you mean?
What are you talking about?
Leovinus was almost crying.
This whole project's a financial catastrophe. Didn't you realize that? We're on the brink of a major fiscal meltdown.
Bobostigan was trying to get to the door, but Leovinus, with surprising agility, was back on his feet and cutting off the exit.
So, what are you trying to do?
But even as he asked the question, Leovinus suddenly saw, with total clarity, the whole plot.
The insurance!
He gasped.
You're going to scuttle my priceless ship and claim the insurance!
Grow up, growled Bobostigan. This is the real world! But he never got any further. The aged genius had hurled himself upon him, hitting the manager squarely on the chin with a remarkably mundane uppercut. Bobostigan lurched backwards, caught his foot in one of Titania's wings, and fell into the succubus tray. The moment he did, the succubus robot was activated. It leant forward, extending its brass snout.
Always a pleasure to dispose of your rubbish.
And it sucked Bobostigan up. There was an unpleasant crunching sound and a slight plop, and the project manager was gone. The succubus system was a rather controversial part of the ship's design. In an age when telepresence was all the rage, the idea of transmitting objects around the ship quite physically and literally by means of vacuum tubes seemed old-fashioned and retrogressive. But Leovinus had insisted. It was yet another little irony that he cherished. He finally carried the day by using the safety argument. The physical transport was always less risky than teleportation or any pseudo-travel arrangement. What's more, his succubus robots would be able to categorize and sort everything put into their tray. So if you failed to tell them where you wanted your object sending, they would do it automatically. The system, however, was not designed for human beings, and the succubus was supposed to be programmed to reject any living human who might fall into the tray. Clearly this was yet another area where compromises had been made. Leovinus knew, with a queasy tingle, that Brobostigan had become the victim of his own plot, and would now be a condensed cube of detritus on its way to the ship's bilge. And now the full impact of the situation began to come home to the great man. Here he was, the greatest genius the galaxy had ever known, the day before the launch of his ultimate masterpiece, with an unfinished ship, a financial crisis of which he had known nothing, and a dead project manager caught in the act of sabotage. This was not going to look good in the official biography. Meanwhile, where was Scraliontis? Crossa Brobostigan had said her husband had come to the ship to meet the accountant. Leovinus knelt beside the disfigured Titania, and lovingly slipped the silver shard into the nerve centre at the base of her skull. His hand shook as he realized the other artery was still missing. In fact, now he came to look, most of her brain was missing. How had he not noticed that before? Titania's brain, so delicate it was, the slightest shock or scratch could permanently injure it. With a ship of this sophistication, it was especially dangerous to have the nerve centre non-functional. There had been recent stories about a new phenomenon, a kind of high-tech metal fatigue that could afflict certain artifacts which had too high a density of logic systems built into them. SMEF. Spontaneous, massive existence failure. Leovinus knew it was theoretically possible, if unlikely. He also knew that practically every molecule on the starship Titanic was in some way part of the ship's logic system. If the thing were launched in its present state, who knows what catastrophe might follow. There was no time to lose. He must retrieve all Titania's missing parts and reassemble them before the unthinkable could happen. Some moments later, Leovinus was to be found in the starboard embarkation lobby, yelling at the deskbot. "Of course you know Scraliontis!" The deskbot, while remaining perfectly polite, was showing no inclination to be helpful. "Scrawny little man, glasses, he's the accountant of this whole project, for crying out loud. You've seen him snooping about here thousands of times." "Much to my regret, sir, I've been scanning my acquaintance database and am unable to come up with anyone matching the criteria you indicate. However, I am in a position to offer you a berth on the starboard Supergalactic Traveller E-deck. The rooms are painted pink, and the noise from the disposal unit is hardly noticeable." "I want to know where Scraliontis is." Leovinus flashed a small gold card in front of the deskbot. Written on the card was the legend 60 Million Club. The deskbot sat up brightly. "Certainly, sir. I would suggest you look for Mr. Scraliontis in the first-class restaurant." The first-class restaurant was a black-tie-only affair, so the maitre d' was understandably shocked when a disreputable elderly man suddenly burst in and shouted, "Scraliontis, I know you're in here!" "What an honour to have you here, sir," exclaimed the maitre d' genially. "However, I am sure, sir, would be more comfortable in the second-class brasserie." "Shut up," said Leovinus. "Of course, sir. It will be a great pleasure to not only shut up, but belt up, cease to babble, and generally get lost for you, sir. But may I point out that we would be only too happy to oblige, sir, with some appropriate attire, if sir would be so good as to follow me." Leovinus had spotted Scraliontis, who was standing at the controls of the telepresence robot, trying to fit something into the succubus. He glanced up when he heard Leovinus's voice, smiled thinly, and hid whatever it was inside his dinner jacket. "But sir would surely not want to feel at a disadvantage vis-à-vis the other diners. May I recommend a change of vestment before partaking of cocktails?" The maitre d' blocked Leovinus's path as he headed towards Scraliontis. For a moment, the great man lost sight of the accountant as the robot bobbed and weaved, bowing and nodding in front of him. "Just get out of my way," growled Leovinus. "It would be my pleasure, sir, but may I remind you that whilst smoking is permitted in the first-class restaurant, it is a jacket and tie affair, and I'm afraid I shall have to call for assistance if sir proceeds any further."
You're too late, Leovinus.
yelled Scraliontis.
This thing is going nowhere, and it's going there tomorrow at noon. Fast!
The accountant always did enjoy talking in elliptical sentences that didn't quite make sense. It gave him the feeling that he was in some way literary, despite his occupation. "Stop whatever it is you're doing!" shouted Leovinus. "Oh, we appreciate your visit, sir, and hope to see you many times in the future, but if you could just lower your voice a touch, I will show you to the exit as soon as possible." "I said shut up!" Leovinus suddenly turned on the robot as it made yet another bow in front of him, and picked it up and hurled it bodily at Scraliontis. "May I recommend, sir, to the fire exit? I think sir will find the plainness of the corridors more suited to his current garb," remarked the maitre d'-bot as it hit the accountant full in the face, sending him sprawling. The object Scraliontis had been hiding fell onto the floor with a tinkle. It was the other cerebral artery of Titania's brain. At the same moment, the robot burst apart on the elegant floor of the restaurant. Scraliontis scrambled to his feet, grabbed one of the robot's legs, and charged at Leovinus. The old man sidestepped, picked up the robot's right arm, and faced the accountant. For a few moments, the two circled each other. Then Scraliontis opened with a straight thrust into an open line. The robot's leg grazed against Leovinus's shoulder, scoring a high outside. Leovinus replied with a simple parry from the fourth position, executing a deft circle with the robot's arm that gained him the right to riposte. But Scraliontis was clearly fencing under a different rulebook, for he went straight to a redoublement regardless of Leovinus's right to riposte. The great genius was outraged. He flung the robot's arm at Scraliontis in an attack that certainly didn't figure in any rulebook, and closed in for a corps à corps, throwing any pretense to dueling etiquette to the wind. Leovinus now had his hands round Scraliontis' neck.
Probostigans!
Screamed Scraliontis.
Help!
Probostigans garbage! The normally kind and mellow face of Leovinus had taken on an evil green hue. This was mainly due to the fact that the lamp of the table on which they were now wrestling was directly under Leovinus's chin.
He made it garbage,
Gasped Scraliontis.
but he's got a gun.
"He's dead!" yelled Leovinus. His fingers were beginning to tighten on the accountant's neck. If he'd known Proboscidean had had a gun, he would have been a bit more careful how he treated him.
Ah! You're choking me!
Screamed Scraliontis. "I know! That's what I'm trying to do!" Leovinus tried to put some conviction into his voice, but he was finding it extremely difficult to make his fingers actually constrict the accountant's scrawny neck. I suppose you could say that Leovinus just did not have the killer instinct. Scraliontis, on the other hand, did. As he realized Leovinus was never going to carry through what he was attempting, Scraliontis had tightened his hand around the table lamp, a conventionalized statuette of Titania with her wings providing the illumination. As he felt the great genius's hands falter around his neck, Scraliontis brought his knee up into Leovinus's groin. At the same time, he raised up the table lamp and brought it crashing down onto that magnificent cranium that housed Leovinus's magnificent brain. Leovinus's hands fell from the accountant's neck. He slumped to his knees. Crack! Scraliontis brought the table lamp crashing down onto Leovinus's skull again and again. The extraordinary and superb mind registered all was not right. It blocked out the pain, then realized something truly disastrous had taken place, and wisely decided to abandon all future contact with the outside world for the foreseeable future. Leovinus rolled over onto the restaurant floor unconscious, with blood pouring from his head. Scraliontis stared down at him. God! He'd killed the great man! In a panic, Scraliontis glanced around the first-class restaurant. Disposing of dead bodies, although not something he'd done before, was the sort of thing his accountant's mind was really good at. But a few moments later, he was hurrying out of the first-class restaurant with a spring in his step. In his panic, however, he had forgotten the little glowing silver shard that now lay on the floor mingled amongst the remains of the maitre d'-bot. Leovinus was wrapped securely in one of the great curtains that helped give the first-class restaurant its ambience of unadulterated luxury and elegance. While Leovinus had been thus engaged with business matters, the journalist had been trying to pump information out of the workman who claimed to have come on board to reclaim his parrot.
come on, said the journalist. Nobody's buying that. What are you really up to?
I have a pet parrot, said the workman doggedly, sticking to his absurd story.
I always take it with me when I'm working. I know Mr. Leovinus wouldn't allow a bird on board, so I've been keeping it hidden. But when I came back to get it just now, I found that some bastard had opened the door of the cage and it's escaped.
The journalist heaved his eyes heavenwards. He was used to hearing cock and bull stories, but this parrot and bastard one didn't even get off the slippery starting blocks of meretriciousness.
Look, he said, I'm a journalist. I know when there's something fishy going on, and I know that you're hiding something. I'll cut a deal with you.
The workman turned on him.
I'm really very upset. I love that parrot. You tell me everything you know about the starship, and I'll not tell Starstruck Inc. about the parrot.
They had just reached the central dome area, and the worker was hurrying through the gallery surrounding the central well towards the port embarkation lobby.
Why's the work got so behind? They've been cutting corners, haven't they? Leovinus seemed to be in the dark about it, and all these stories about the financial problems, they're true, aren't they? What's going to happen tomorrow? This ship isn't in a fit state to take off, is it?
That's right, said the worker as he strode across the embarkation lobby.
Everything you say is true.
If you're enjoying your stay on board, why not celebrate with an evening in the Champion Canapé Lounge, featuring canapés from the All Blerontin finals for 6 centuries, called the desk bot.
So, said the journalist.
So, said the worker, turning on the journalist and looking him in the eye for the first time.
If you see my parrot, give it this.
He pressed a small metal band into the journalist's hand and disappeared through the main doors. The journalist looked at the piece of metal in his hand. It bore an address and a phone number which the journalist recognized as that of the Yassican Embassy in Blerontis. The journalist spent the next half hour or so exploring the ship on his own. He discovered more unfinished areas. The starboard embarkation lobby, for example, was totally unfinished. Large sections of the second-class living quarters needed decorating, some were even without beds. He noted everything down and returned to the central dome, when suddenly a figure came hurtling round the columns of the gallery and collided with him.
"Drut Squaliontis!" he exclaimed.
"I know who I am,"
snapped the accountant. "Just the man I was looking for," smiled the journalist.
Ah!
Squaliontis jumped, and his eyes shot guiltily over the journalist's shoulder, as if expecting to see the homicide police with their vicious, trained rabbits pouring onto the starship to arrest the murderer of the greatest genius the galaxy had ever known.
"He's not dead, I swear it."
"Who's not dead?" The journalist couldn't believe how many juicy stories seemed to be offering themselves up to him tonight. If only he could pin one of them down. "Who isn't dead?" Squaliontis now realized he'd made a mistake.
"Get out of my way!"
he yelled. "Not so fast," exclaimed the journalist. But Squaliontis had reached a point beyond the bounds of politeness. He shoved the journalist so he fell back against a pillar and started to run. The journalist picked himself up, charged after the accountant, and brought him down in what would have been referred to as a rugby tackle if they had played rugby football on Blerontin. Squaliontis fought with the energy of a trapped animal. He scratched at the journalist's face and punched and kicked. The two managed to stagger to their feet, still fighting like two snorks in a bucket of snork swill, an old Blerontinian expression. The journalist, being young and fitter, soon had the accountant backed up against the barrier rail of the great central well. As he tried to restrict Squaliontis's movements, he could see past him down the dizzying depths of the well, down and down seemingly forever, a breathtaking, intimidating and yet somehow inspiring sight.
"Tell me what's going on!"
The journalist was pinning Squaliontis's arms to his side.
"What's the scam?"
"Scam?" sneered Squaliontis.
"You'll never find out."
"Oh, yes, I will," said the journalist.
"Very well, I'll tell you everything,"
replied Squaliontis, rather surprisingly.
The journalist was totally wrong-footed. He almost said, "Oh, no, you won't," but he fortunately managed to stop himself. Oh, that's very decent of you," he managed to say. But he was not fool enough to let go of Squaliontis's arms.
"We're going to blow it up. How's that for a story?"
The journalist was now fool enough to let go of Squaliontis's arms.
"You mean there's a bomb on board the starship?"
"But you'll never find it,"
grinned Squaliontis.
"because you won't be alive."
And suddenly Squaliontis had something in his hand. The journalist didn't see what it was, but he felt a stab in the ribs. He staggered back, bent over, and looked up. Squaliontis was standing with one of the first-class dining room table lamps in his hand. The sharp, illuminated tip was dripping with blood. At that very moment, however, there was a terrible screech and a flash of colours as a large parrot suddenly hurtled out of the arches straight at Skraliontis. The accountant tried to fend it off, but the creature's wings kept beating at his face, and its beak was tearing at his nose, and the accountant scrambled back against the barrier rail, flailing with his arms and screaming,
Get it off! Get it off!
And then it happened. It was one of those ironic moments that fitted perfectly into Leovinus's current architectural style, and it gave the journalist his first piece of hard evidence that corners had indeed been cut during the construction of the starship Titanic. Skraliontis had, of course, been the main instigator of the plan to reduce the construction costs of the starship. It had become clear that the whole project could never break even, let alone go into profit. It was, in fact, heading for total, enormous financial disaster. His and Bobostigan's reputations and personal fortunes were both on the line. There was only one clean, simple, rational solution, and that was to scuttle the ship and claim the insurance. The ship was, of course, already heavily insured, and Skraliontis made sure that those policies were beefed up, and that all monies repayable were routed through companies owned by Skraliontis and Bobostigan. Construction costs had to be cut to the bone, and building restricted to the merely cosmetic. He had, unbeknownst to Leovinus, instructed contractors to halve and then quarter the specifications of any number of elements on board. One of the materials that had been generously economized on was the metal employed in the barrier rail surrounding the great central well.
After all,
Skraliontis had remarked,
there aren't going to be any passengers to lean on it, so why make it unnecessarily strong?
The reason, he now realized, was that it might not be a passenger who leaned on it. It might actually be the project accountant who leaned back against it in a moment of forgetfulness while under assault by a parrot. But the realization came too late. Skraliontis heard the feeble metal crack, and the next moment found himself falling backwards into the abyss. By the time the horrified journalist made it to the broken rail and looked down, Skraliontis was a tiny figure, still no more than a third way down the great central well, turning gently in circles, waving his arms and shouting up ever more faintly,
Bloody parrots!
The parrot in question alighted on the journalist's shoulder.
Bloody accountants!
It said. The vicious rabbits had been brought back under control. The overexcited riot police had been calmed down by their chief, and the Yassican protesters lay groaning in mangled bloody heaps on the ground. It had been a totally successful exercise in crowd management. Flortin Romanquis saluted smartly as he reported back to the Gat of Bloontis.
Everything under control, your magnificent beneficence, he said. You may proceed with the launch.
But Leovinus is still missing, replied the Gat. He was extremely concerned that he might miss out on the great photo opportunity of being seen arm in arm with the greatest genius the galaxy had ever produced. It was exactly the sort of thing his sagging poll ratings needed, his publicity agent had said.
Whatever you do, get your photo taken next to Leovinus.
It was, indeed, the single most important thing on the Gat's mind throughout the whole proceedings.
We regret your ultimate lordship,
said the chief of police with another sharp salute.
The crowd down there is 50 million. They are getting extremely restive. I humbly suggest that we get this launch over and done with, so my boys can start dispersing them at once. Otherwise, we might all be sorry.
The Gat could see what he meant. The crowd had already closed in over the bodies of the unfortunate Yassican demonstrators, and he could see fights breaking out all over the launch area. Very well, he sighed. No, thank you, he added, as the minor official offered him a fish paste sandwich.
I'm afraid you have to, your magnificence. It's all part of the ceremony,
whispered the minor official hurriedly. The Gat groaned and took the fish paste sandwich. The band struck up the Bloontin national anthem, and the crowd all stood on their heads, as they always did as a remark of respect to the monarchy. Sirs, madams, and things, intoned the Gat of Bloontis into the ceremonial microphone. This fish paste sandwich is delicious. A cheer went up from the crowd. The Gat sighed again. It was such a pathetic ceremony, he thought. And now it is my privilege to launch this, the greatest starship ever built. Fellow Blewontinians, this is a proud moment for all of us. I name this starship Titanic. May luck be with all who fly in her. And so saying, the Gat let swing the beribboned bottle of French champagne so that it smashed onto the bows of the ship. It may seem odd that a civilization that had never even heard of the planet Earth, and certainly had no idea of its existence, should use French champagne for such an occasion. The explanation is rather complicated and involves a lot of stuff about time warps and black holes and an intergalactic smuggling ring. If I were you, I simply wouldn't worry about it and just take it as read. So, just as the bottle smashed into the ship, the minor official pulled a cord, and the sheeting that hitherto had covered the great starship fell to the ground in a gentle cascade of pink silk. There was a gasp from the multitude. Even a peoples used to the sight of great starships had never before witnessed one of such elegant structure, such flawless design.
Isn't she beautiful?
Sighed countless male starship spotters, scanning their binoscopes over the hull for the registration number.
Your mummy built that,
murmured countless unmarried teenage mothers to their infants. It's a triumph, exclaimed the head reporter, suddenly remembering what his script had written down at this point. There was a ghostly roar, as if of seas beating on a distant shore that lies beyond the horizon of thought, as hugely, magnificently, the fabulous ship eased its way forward from its construction dock. It then picked up speed, swayed a bit, wobbled a bit, veered wildly, and just as the crowd were about to scream out in disbelieving terror, it vanished. Just like that. It had undergone what was about to become famous as SMEF, spontaneous, massive existence failure. In just 10 seconds, the whole stupendous enterprise was over. We're going to put the bathroom here and the door over there, said Dan. It's terrific, said Nettie, but I thought the bathroom was going to be there and the door was going to be over here, said Lucy. Why did he always get it so wrong? Dan always made the effort, and yet, no matter how hard he tried, the things he and Lucy had discussed only the day before entirely eluded him, or came out all garbled. That's what I meant, said Dan. It's terrific, said Nettie, but I have to tell you something. She was interrupted by Nigel, who was sniffing around the cellar. You can smell these centuries of vinous pleasure oozing from the very brickwork, he shouted up. The place is only 180 years old, Lucy shouted back down. It was built as a rectory, Dan murmured to Nettie. Terrific, said Nettie. But look, Dan. You're not kidding. Dan felt the enthusiasm welling up from inside him, the way it always did when he needed it to. We're going to have the restaurant here on the right as you come in, not your nouvelle cuisine, but the state-of-the-art Californian, and here there'll be a bar. Lucy gave him a withering look, but mercifully she didn't correct him. Oh, yes, now he remembered. The restaurant was going to be on the left. It had started off on the left, then they changed it to the right, but then Lucy had pointed out that the kitchen would be better on the other side, so they'd gone back to the left. What the hell was he supposed to remember anyway? Terrific, said Nettie, but look. Her voice trailed off as Nigel reappeared. Nettie looked adorable in a simple Gap t-shirt that didn't quite cover her midriff, and a hand-knitted waistcoat. Nigel put his arm round her. Like what you see? He asked. Said Dan. I mean the house, said Nigel. Dan couldn't stand that effortless, slimy superiority that his business partner could turn on and off like a hosepipe of cold water. No, wait a minute. Make that ex-business partner. The Top 10 travel company was no more. They had just sold it for what seemed to Dan a ridiculously satisfactory amount of money. It's just what Lucy and I have always dreamed of, isn't it, Buttercup? He said. Lucy hated it when he called her pet names in public, but she'd never told him, so she blamed herself. She could see he thought she liked it, and the minor deception had been going on for so long now that she couldn't see how she could possibly tell him. How long had they been together? It must have been all of 13 years. In fact, since the very early days of the Top 10 travel company, when Nigel had chatted her up in a bar on Santa Monica and introduced her to his business partner. Lucy had originally been strongly attracted by the suave Englishman, but as they all got to know each other, she found Dan, the quiet East Coast university man, more real and more understandable. In fact, the more they got to know each other, the more she wondered why on earth nobody could see at first glance what a complete sleazeball Nigel was. We're going to call it the Watergate Hotel, said Dan. Won't that put off Republicans who still want to bug each other, asked Nettie. Nigel patted her bottom. "Go and turn the car around, there's a good girl," he said. And Nettie trotted off on her high heels down the steps of the elegant early Victorian rectory into the night. How can she let him treat her like that, thought Lucy to herself, but said, "When are you going to sign the final release forms for the company, Dan?" No, I'm not sure. Dan seemed suddenly nervous. "I don't think Nigel's got them yet." "The forms should be waiting for us back at the hotel," said Nigel before Lucy could explode. Exploding was a reaction to Nigel which she found increasingly natural. However, in this case the fuse was lit, but would keep burning until they got back to the hotel and found that, surprise, surprise, the release forms hadn't arrived after all, and that damn delivery company had let Nigel down yet again. Poor Nigel, he always had some excuse or other. They turned the lights off in the empty house and made their way across the drive in the darkness. Above them, the stars filled the cold night sky with astonishing clarity.
"Why hasn't Nettie turned the car around?"
A twitch of irritation gave Nigel's suavity a razor edge. When they got to the car, they found Nettie squinting through the lens of a single-reflex Minolta that she had placed on its roof.
What on earth do you think you're doing, bozo?"
When Nigel sounded playful, he was always at his most dangerous. "Shh," said Nettie, "I'm taking a photo of the house. Don't jog the car."
I don't know whether you'd noticed, Einstein."
There was sheer joy in Nigel's voice. He loved ridiculing his girlfriends.
"But it's night."
"Right," replied Nettie, not moving her blonde head so much as a millimetre.
"I'm taking a photo called Dan and Lucy's New Hotel at Night. It'll look great in the album. Maybe you'll frame it in the entrance hall." "You can't take photos at night unless you've got a flash, dumbbell."
Nigel opened the car door.
"Hey, you've jogged it."
"Get in, Brainbox, I'll drive," said Nigel. "Oh, I guess it was long enough," said Nettie to Dan. "Terrific," said Dan. They were all just about to get in the car when a sudden wind swept across the vicarage lawn, and the trees blew, almost as if a hurricane had hit them, except that they all blew in different directions. "Jesus!" exclaimed Dan, gripping the side of the car. "What was that?"
"Look!"
Lucy was pointing up in the sky.
"A falling star!"
"Make a wish!" shouted Nettie. "Holy moly!" growled Nigel, who was the sort of person who'd always preferred Captain Marvel to Superman.
"Will you look at that?"
Above them, a most extraordinary thing was happening. A ring of cloud had suddenly formed immediately overhead, and then spread out, like a nuclear explosion, until the entire sky was covered by a broiling layer of evil-looking cumulus. Nigel went weak at the knees. Lucy shuddered. Dan felt his stomach jump, and Nettie simply gaped. But there was more to come. The four Earth folk heard a ghostly roar, as if of seas beating on a distant shore that lies beyond the horizon of thought. And then, hugely, magnificently, and without warning, a vast metallic prong descended from the cloud and sliced their elegant former Victorian rectory, with planning permission for commercial development, in two. Nigel gaped. Lucy gaped. Dan gaped. "Terrific," murmured Nettie. There was no other noise save the wind rushing crazily around in the trees, as if it were looking for a place to hide, and the occasional thud of falling masonry, as bits of the rectory that had not already been dislodged by the impact crashed to the ground. The thing itself was shiny and vertical, and it stretched up into the clouds as if it always had. It was so huge, so present, that it seemed to have a perfect right to be there. As they watched, a small pinpoint of light descended down the side of the thing and disappeared into the ruined house. Then it went up again. The swirling clouds, meanwhile, had begun to diminish, and by the time the pinpoint of light started to descend for the second time, the clouds had cleared to reveal the full, awesome vastness of the thing. The wide blade or prong that had buried itself in the house stretched up and up, almost a mile into the sky, and there it seemed to widen out into an immense metallic body, rather like a gigantic submarine. "It's a spaceship," murmured Nettie. She began to walk towards it, as if mesmerized, her camera dangling forgotten from her wrist. Suddenly the pinpoint of light shot up again. Don't! Nettie! Come back! Dan yelled. But Lucy was already racing after Nettie, so Dan raced after Lucy. Nigel, in the meantime, tried his best to help by hiding under the steering wheel. "Don't go near it," said Dan.
Nettie!
Lucy was pulling her arm, trying to head her back to the car.
We don't know what it is.
"It's wonderful," murmured Nettie. Something in Nettie's tone made all three of them look up at the great thing and stop whatever it was they were doing. Confronted by something so immense, so beyond their experience or imagination, anything they did suddenly seemed irrelevant, pointless. The pinpoint of light had disappeared into the house for the second time, and there was a glow coming from the hallway. As the three of them brought their eyes back down to earth, they froze. A shadow had appeared on the window of the front door. There's something coming. Dan could feel his knees beginning to quiver. Lucy pulled at Nettie's arm, but Nettie edged forward, as if eager to greet whatever it was that was even now opening the front door of the destroyed vicarage.
Ah!
Screamed Lucy as the thing emerged into the starlight. "Good evening to you, unknown life forms," said the thing. "The proprietors of Starlight Travel, Inc. would like to apologize for any inconvenience you may have suffered due to the inadvertent emergency parking of their vehicle."
Ah! Ah!
Lucy was by now screaming uncontrollably. Nigel was covering his ears and trying to get even further under the steering wheel of the car. "It's all right, Lucy." Dan was trying to calm her down.
Ah! Ah! Ah!
Lucy was not about to be calmed down by anybody. She was confronted by an alien from outer space, and she was jolly well going to have a good scream. "Shh," said Nettie. "It's talking to us." "Quite," said the thing from outer space. "By way of an apology, may we have the pleasure of offering you a free cruise on board our starship?" "Perhaps another day," said Dan.
Ah! 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 Ah!
Continued Lucy.
"Yes," cried Nettie. "I'd love to."
"Come with me, madam," said the thing from outer space, and it turned smartly back into the ruined house.
"Well, come on," said Nettie. "Oh, what a hoot!"
And before either Lucy or Dan could stop her, she had followed it through the front door. Dan hesitated, and then realized he had no choice. Before Lucy could start screaming again, he was racing after Nettie, and Lucy found herself racing after Dan. The thing was now standing by an illuminated porch, by the light of which they could now see that the thing appeared to be nothing more frightening than a smartly dressed robot wearing headphones, who bowed politely to them and apologized for having to invite them into the service elevator. "Please do not be alarmed," it said in a soothing voice. "I can assure you that the Starship Titanic is the most luxurious and technologically advanced intergalactic starship ever built." It bowed again and ushered them in, and somehow or other, neither Dan nor Lucy nor Nettie could later quite explain why, they all three found themselves entering the elevator. Before they knew what was happening, the steps had retracted up behind them, and the robot had flicked a switch. "I apologize once again for having to bring you in by the service elevator," remarked the robot. "Entrance to the starship is normally at embarkation level." "Hey!" exclaimed Dan. "How come you speak English?" Dan felt better now he'd found something concrete to question. "I beg your pardon, but I am not speaking, what did you say, English? All robotic functions in public areas on the ship are equipped with infraviolet translation sensors, which automatically scan the brain impulses of passengers for language patterns. These patterns are then rearranged inside your heads so that you can understand and speak intelligibly while on the ship. You are actually speaking and understanding Blerontinian. Pretty convenient for writers of science fiction, eh?" Dan wasn't sure what to make of this last remark. Was the robot implying that he was nothing more than a figment of some writer's mind, and that this whole thing was not really happening? However, before he could think any further along these lines, his mind was overwhelmed by the fantastic situation in which they now found themselves. They were speeding vertically up the vast keel towards the main body of the starship, a mile above the surface of the Earth. Nigel stabbed out a number on his mobile and called half-heartedly out of the car window,
"Dan, Lucy, Nettie?"
but his voice barely reached the crumbled brickwork of the ruined house. The next moment he heard a ghostly roar, like seas beating on a far-off shore.
Hello, said his mobile. Oxford Police Station, can I help you?
Nigel didn't reply. He was too busy watching the vast, unbelievable thing as it rose up into the air again and disappeared towards the Milky Way.
Hello? Hello? This is Oxford Police Station, insisted his mobile phone. Who's this?
Nigel looked at the smashed Victorian vicarage and the driveway where his friends had stood a few moments ago and replaced his mobile on its cradle. It didn't happen, he murmured to himself. It didn't happen. You might have thought there was a tinge of relief in the way his shoulders relaxed, but of course you would have dismissed such an idea as total fantasy. In any case, at that same moment, Nigel suddenly became very unrelaxed again. In fact, he very nearly jumped out of his Armani trousers. He certainly hit his head on the roof of the car. "Ouch!" he yelled. An old man with a flowing white beard was sitting quietly in the passenger seat. There were tears in his eyes, and one of his eyebrows was just about to fall off. The moment the ship took off, Dan felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. This was, of course, simply the result of the incredible G-force that was beginning to be exerted upon his body. But Dan, who had no idea that the ship had taken off, merely thought he was getting nervous. The sinking feeling in the stomach was quickly followed by a draining of blood from the brain, leading to momentary lightheadedness, followed by total blackout. If he hadn't just passed out, Dan would have noticed that the takeoff had affected Lucy and Nettie in an identical way, even though none of them knew what was happening. Nothing to be alarmed about, sir, madam and thing? The polite robot seemed to be addressing this last at the now comatose Nettie.
A perfectly routine takeoff. You life forms have a good snooze, while us machines get on with running the ship.
The doorbot itself then blacked out and lay in a tidy heap, while the ship accelerated at speeds far beyond its original specifications, towards an unknown quarter of the intergalactic space-time continuum. The robots on board must have recovered consciousness before the humans. Nettie found herself undressed and tucked up in bed in a tiny cabin about the size of her flat back in Haringey. Apart from the size, everything about the place was unfamiliar. The sheets on the bed were made of some material that felt like silk, but much thicker and heavier. The mug holding the toothbrush bore a picture of an elderly Egyptian opera singer, or at least that's who it looked like to Nettie. She'd once received a postcard of an elderly Egyptian opera singer and had kept it in her drawer. The toothbrush itself was rather weird, since it kept ducking its head and brushing its own handle, rather like a bird preening itself. Opposite the bed was a television, on which a snowstorm seemed to be the only entertainment. Nettie picked up the remote, aimed it at the TV, and started pressing buttons. A cocktail cabinet rose out of the floor. A dust spot scuttled out of the clothes cupboard, picked up an invisible speck of dust, squeaked, "Thank you for appreciating a clean environment," and hurried back out of sight again. The door opened, the lights went on and off, but the TV resolutely refused to show any program other than the snowstorm.
Hi! I'm glad to see you found your personal electronic thingy. Please keep it with you at all times, since it's your communication with the starship Titanic. Welcome aboard!
Nettie found herself apparently being addressed by the standard lamp that stood in the corner of the cabin. She instinctively pulled the sheets up to cover her breasts.
"Wow, hey! I don't blame you keeping those babies to yourself," exclaimed the standard lamp.
"Will you turn around while I get dressed?" said Nettie. The lamp obediently turned around. It was the same on the other side. "Will you please go away?" she said.
"Hey, that'll be groovy! I've had it up to here with standing around this cabin anyway."
The standard lamp walked smartly towards the door.
"Oh, by the way," it said breezily, "I'm your bellbot. Anything you want, just ask me. I'll be standing outside. Wow, it's great to get a change of scenery." And closed the door.
"I'm sure that robot's not meant to behave like that," said Nettie to herself. She threw on her clothes and examined the thing she had mistaken for the TV remote control. On it were a variety of buttons. One of them had an icon of the bellbot on it, so she pressed it, and the door reopened and the bellbot peered in.
"Wow, Z! You look terrific in that Gap t-shirt!"
it exclaimed. "Will you please refrain from making personal comments?" said Nettie rather crossly.
Hey, no offense, man. The bellbot seemed genuinely hurt. What can I do for you? Firstly, I want to meet up with my colleagues. Secondly, I think we probably would like to know how to get off this ship. Hot dog! The bellbot snapped its fingers. You mean there are more hot little numbers like you around? You are behaving most impolitely for an android. Nettie knew how to address a robot. Would you please keep your personal comments to yourself, otherwise I will have you reported, and you know what that'll mean. The bellbot froze to the spot. Hey man, I'm a genuine personality transfer bot. It's my character. Well, I don't like it, and you're here to serve me, so just stop it at once. The robot went all sulky. Oh, all right, don't go on about it. Do you know where my friends are? Adjoining rooms, suggested the bellbot. Nettie was out of her cabin in a moment. Every door along the narrow corridor that curved round and out of vision had writing on it. What's this say? She asked. By way of answer, the robot produced a pair of spectacles and offered them to Nettie. Nettie hesitated, then put them on. Translator specs, explained the bellbot unhappily. Nettie could now see that every door had a name. Hyacinth, Jasmine, Delphinium, and so on. How tacky, murmured Nettie. She started knocking on Cauliflower. After a dozen or so vain attempts on various flora, she turned on the bellbot, which was walking quietly behind her with its hands folded behind its back. Look, do you or do you not know where my friends are? I do not, said the robot. Do you or do you not know how I can go about finding them? Nettie was phrasing her questions carefully. I do, said the bellbot after some thought. Then tell me how, said Nettie. Guest list, announced the robot. And where's that? Desk bot. Embarkation lobby, embarkation floor, replied the bot. Can't I just ring from my room? Not from the Supergalactic Traveller class suites, no. Then show me the way to the embarkation lobby, said Nettie. Ah, replied the bellbot, I'm afraid I can't leave this deck. But if you go along to the lifts, the lift bot will take care of all your vertical transportation requirements, and then a door bot will escort you round the embarkation lobby. Nettie sighed. She could already tell that travelling supergalactic class was not going to be glamorous. Lucy came to her senses to hear a loud knocking sound. She sat up and looked around an unfamiliar room. It was tiny, cramped, and had a hideous lampstand in one corner. The television wasn't working properly, and the colour scheme was a ghastly pink. There was a constant grinding sound coming from underneath the floor, and besides that there was this wretched knocking on what she now began to recognise as the door. Lucy! Lucy now realised there was a voice accompanying the knocking. Open the door! It was Dan's voice. How? You've got a little remote control thingy. Use that, shouted Dan. After a bit of fumbling, she managed to get the door opened, and there was Dan, standing in a dingy corridor, running his fingers through his hair like he always did. Oh, thank God you're okay. He smiled that mile wide of his, and Lucy flung herself at him as if she were drowning. What happened? She cried. We're going to find out. Thank goodness he sounded more confident than he felt. We're in that spaceship, aren't we? Lucy wished she didn't sound so unconfident, because now she had Dan there, she felt really everything was going to be all right. Oh, let's find Nettie and get out of this thing as fast as possible, said Dan. Apparently we can only locate other passengers by going up to the embarkation lobby. You'd think a thing this sophisticated would have room-to-room telephones. The lift entrance in the Supergalactic Traveller class offered no view of the central well. But once you stepped into the lift, the sudden sheer vastness of the well took you by surprise. Lucy and Dan found themselves speechless. Huh, said the lift bot. If Sir, Madam, or Thing would care to give some indication of their vertical travelling requirements, I might be able to get on with my job, such as it is. The embarkation lobby, please, said Dan. You asking me to go up? Am I? Asked Dan. The embarkation lobby is on the embarkation level, sir. The lift bot spoke in the tone of voice most people would only dream of using to address particularly stupid patches of damp. Then that's where we'd like to go. Up? I suppose so. The lift bot fetched up a groan from deep within and muttered to itself, Young people nowadays don't give a tinker's cuss for them as went through the hell of 2 world wars that left some of us with one arm and a broken marriage.
Lucy kicked Dan as she felt him about to reply.
Just take us to the embarkation lobby.
This was her best Rodeo Drive, no hostages taken voice, which she used when buying antique rugs. The liftbot stifled a pathetic sniffle, put its hand to the handle sticking out from its chest, and pushed it up with a sigh. The elevator gathered speed, and the humans were once again silenced by the spectacular magnificence of the starship. Lucy put a hand into Dan's. In her dreams, she had imagined places of such scale and splendour, but she'd always known that they belonged strictly to the world of the imagination. And yet here she was, in an interior that matched up to her dreams. The old rectory, which Dan had been so crazy about, looked pretty tawdry compared with this. She glanced sideways at Dan. She couldn't guess what he was thinking. Then again, she never could. As they stepped out of the elevator, into the loggia at the top of the great central well, they caught sight of a blonde figure in high heels disappearing into the far door. By the time they reached the embarkation lobby, they found Nettie apparently deep in conversation with a desk light. This is the embarkation lobby, sir and madam. A doorbot had already wheeled over and was gesticulating in front of them in a rather meaningless fashion. As supergalactic travellers, you are entitled to pass through this lobby, but you may not use the seating accommodation or the bathrooms. Supergalactic class facilities are available on your own decks. Look, we're not travelling, said Dan. We just want to know how to get out of this thing. At that moment, Nettie, who seemed to be getting nowhere with the desk light, turned and spotted them. Hey, there you are, she called, and then turned back to the desk light.
Listen, bulb brain, you can fill your own request forms in triplicate and shove them up your lampshade.
The desk light rested its head in its hands and pretended to be looking somewhere else. Get off this thing, the doorbot was repeating to itself as Nettie joined them. Yeah, replied Dan, we want to get out, the quickest way. Oh, Nettie looked rather puzzled. Don't you just want to see round a bit? You're not scared?
Well, a bit, but it's so exciting, and these things seem to be perfectly harmless.
Nettie gave the doorbot a chuck under the chin. It sniffed and pretended to flick a bit of fluff off its sleeve. A dustbot shot out from the skirting, picked up the imaginary bit of fluff, squeaked, and shot back into the skirting again.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Ventured Lucy uncertainly.
Sensational, agreed Nettie.
Look, we've got to be sensible, said Dan, adopting his I'm-in-charge manner that never fooled anyone. We ought to find the exit so we know where we are, and then maybe we could explore a bit if you really want. I'm afraid you can't, sir. The doorbot sniffed in that particular way designed to make anyone who hasn't paid a fortune for their ticket to snooty travel agents in Kensington feel like unwashed dandruff.
Can't what?
Said Lucy. I'm afraid you can't leave the ship, replied the doorbot. Now, if you wouldn't mind hurrying through to your own decks...
Hey, wait a minute.
Dan had decided to turn nasty, which in his case was usually as nasty as a packet of Band-Aids. What do you mean we can't leave the ship? Are we prisoners? Nettie sounded faintly thrilled.
No, madam or thing, of course you are not prisoners. It is simply a physical impossibility for you to leave at this moment in time, because the starship is in flight.
The doorbot coughed and indicated the loggia and the great central well. I suggest you all go down to the supergalactic traveller class restaurant, where you will encounter plain home cooking with a great doorway. The news that they were in flight had a remarkable effect on the three human beings. If there had been a window, they would all have undoubtedly dashed to it. As there was not, all the energy that would have gone into that dashing had to be used up somehow. Nettie used it up by doing some aerobic movements designed to release stress. Lucy and Dan used it up by shouting at Nettie. Dan chose plain abuse. You see what you've done? Oh my God, we're in space! It's all your fault!
I knew it!
Lucy was going for guilt-provoking self-recrimination.
I knew we shouldn't have followed that dumb peroxide airhead.
Please refrain from shouting on the embarkation level. There may be first or second class passengers about. You may shout as much as you want on the supergalactic traveller class decks. Again, the doorbot indicated the way down. Nettie was holding up her hands. Hey, guys, calm down! Why should we calm down? Dan had hit histrionic mode.
You've just destroyed our future home. You've forced us onto an alien spacecraft, and now we're not even on Earth anymore. God knows how we'll ever get back.
Please, said Nettie, I didn't destroy your future home.
No, I'm sorry. I know, I just got carried away.
Dan didn't know why he'd said that.
And if we really are in the situation this robot tells us we're in, we'd better keep our heads and decide how to get out of it.
Lucy had decided to set aside her admiration for the fabulous decor of the ship and had reverted to primal scream mode. Please scream on the supergalactic travel class decks only, urged the Doorbot.
Do, shouted Dan. Do, what can we do?
I suggest, said Nettie firmly, we find the captain, there must be one, explain our situation and ask him to take us home.
Fine, fine.
Dan was beside himself with sarcasm.
Fine, find the captain. Why didn't I think of that? Oh, yes, brilliant idea.
Actually, that is a pretty good idea. Continued Lucy after a short pause.
Shut up, said Dan.
It was the first time he'd ever spoken to Lucy like that, and she shut up in surprise. Where can we find the captain? Nettie turned to the Doorbot, who was looking about anxiously to make sure no other passengers were being incommoded by all this supergalactic traveller class screaming. The captain, madam or thing, is to be found on the captain's bridge, said the Doorbot coldly, with killing logic. And where do we find that? You don't, said the robot firmly. The captain's bridge is accessible only from the first class accommodation. Well, surely we can just go through in order to get to the bridge, reasoned Nettie. I'm afraid not, sniffed the Doorbot. All travelling area restrictions are strictly observed on this vessel.
Oh, come off it, exclaimed Dan. This is an emergency.
Over there, said Nettie. She had just put on her translator specs and could now read the words, first-class passengers only beyond this point, on a door at the other end of the lobby.
Hey, that's pretty neat, exclaimed Dan when Nettie had explained how she knew which way to go.
Said Lucy. Sorry, I didn't mean to scream. It's just that robot moves so fast.
And it was true. The moment Dan and Nettie and Lucy stepped towards the first-class entrance, the Doorbot had overtaken them and was standing in between them and the doorway.
I regret, sir, madam, and thing.
Stop calling me a thing, said Nettie.
Supergalactic class travellers are not allowed beyond this point. Now, if you'd kindly return to your own decks.
Hey, get out of the way, Jeeves, said Dan, and he pushed past the robot.
Sir will find the door sealed, sniffed the Doorbot, and if you do not return to your own quarters, I shall be forced to call in the ship's security officers. They have vicious rabbits.
Dan and Lucy were by now pushing and pulling on the first-class door, but it was clearly a pointless exercise. Oh, there must be another way of doing this, said Nettie. Something about her tone of voice made Dan and Lucy calm down and return to rational thinking.
Okay, said Dan, let me handle this. After all, travel is, or has been, my business. What we have here is the commonest problem known to travellers the world over. How do we get a free upgrade?
Ha! Dan recognised the response immediately. Corporate dumb insolence. If you don't tell us how to get a free upgrade immediately, I shall report you to the Travel Association. It was a bluff, but it seemed to succeed.
I cannot help you there, sir.
The contempt in the robot's voice was now so palpable that it made your skin feel rough.
You will have to inquire with the desk bot, and he indicated the desk lamp that Nettie had been talking to earlier.
Ha! Snorted Nettie. That machine's about as helpful as a strapless ball gown under G-force. But Dan had already run over to it and was now preparing to humiliate himself on an heroic scale.
Look, he began, we have been misassigned our accommodation. This, as I expect you recognize, is Gloria Stanley, the actress.
Dan pointed at Nettie, who immediately caught onto his drift, and dutifully treated the desk bot to a sultry look.
I am her manager, and this young lady is her lawyer.
Lucy really did look the part in her pinstripe power suit.
We should have been given first-class tickets, but our travel agent screwed up the booking. Can you reassign us immediately?
The desk bot raised its shade or head and stared with its two lamps straight at Dan. He squirmed, but held his composure. And which travel agency would that be? Asked the desk bot.
Top 10 Travel.
Dan was well into his role by now. The deskbot blinked a few times as if running through a file somewhere in its database. There was a sort of bing noise, and it drummed its fingers on the desk. I have no record of such an agency in the galaxy. I can assure you it does exist, said Dan, whilst thinking, well, it did exist up till this morning.
Look, we must get an upgrade to first.
Lucy decided to chime in. Oh, yes, madam. The deskbot had become insolent polite. To whose account would any upgrade be charged?
Mayhem, Bader and List,
said Lucy. It was the name of her law firm.
We have no record of such a company, said the deskbot. Hey, you didn't even check your database,
exclaimed Lucy indignantly. The deskbot blinked a couple of times, and there was another bing noise. The deskbot leant forward. I can only upgrade you if you pay the difference in advance. How much is that? Dan felt they were on a slippery slope here. 70 million piastres or 2 pnaides. Currency is not accepted, and you may only pay by Galactic Gold credit card. Dan decided to change tack. I don't think you quite appreciate who Gloria Stanley is. I don't give a stuff who Gloria Stanley is, said the deskbot, suddenly and rather surprisingly. I can only upgrade you if you pay in advance with a Galactic Gold card. Oh, let it go, muttered Nettie, who hated this sort of thing. Look, said Lucy in her best lawyer's conciliatory tone, there must be some way you could organise an upgrade for us. We're valuable customers. The deskbot seemed to do a quick check, this time on a small screen set in the desk. Super Galactic Traveller Class, complimentary, it read. You're on free tickets. Exactly, we're valued customers, celebrities. Dan had thrown caution to the wind, but the deskbot shook its shade. If it had had a lip, it would have curled. I'm sorry, there is absolutely nothing I can do. You simply cannot upgrade from Super Galactic Traveller Class, let alone on a complimentary ticket, to first class. Perhaps if you were second class, I could do something. Look, said Nettie to the desk light, we don't care what class we travel. Oh, I do, said Dan. So do I, exclaimed Lucy. All we want to do, Nettie continued, is talk to the captain. Can you put us through to him? I have no means of contacting the captain, replied the deskbot. And in any case, it is against company policy to allow supergalactic class travellers, especially complimentary ones, access to any of the senior officers. God, muttered Nettie to the other two, I can't stand this sort of thing. There must be some way of getting through to the captain. Look, how can we get reassigned to second class? Lucy could see that Dan was now well and truly in the grip of one of those powerful forces known to man, the desire for a free upgrade. She knew that nothing could stop him. That surely can't be too much to ask. Dan was halfway between whining and cajoling. The deskbot started to look earnestly at the ceiling. That's a pretty shade you're wearing. Lucy had decided to try another approach. It's just the company colours, said the deskbot. Oh, but it suits you, said Lucy. Dan rolled his eyes. Look. He tried to reassert control in the discussion, but the deskbot interrupted. You have free upgrade vouchers in your rooms. Now, please, I have better things to do. Vouchers! Dan was grunting this as they raced back through the loggia at the top of the central well. Isn't that a travel industry all over? Why do they never tell you these things in the first place? The liftbot was in a cheerier mood, but only just. Down. That's what Chalky White yelled at me outside that foxhole at Ypres. It was the last thing he ever did say. Buzz bomb took him out. Same bomb as took out my arm and leg. Dan. I can hear his voice to this day. By the time the elevator had reached the supergalactic travel class deck, the three had heard a full account of the rudimentary medical facilities available at the Caen dressing station, the technical details of cleaning out gangrene from a deep wound, and a near-complete itemization of their Allied forces' requisitioning techniques in Cyprus. For a robot from a civilization which knew nothing of Earth, it was a very impressive performance. God, I just hope we don't have to use that elevator many more times, groaned Dan. The three raced off down the supergalactic traveller class corridor. They were about halfway down when they suddenly realized there was a major problem. Primula, Dahlia, Chrysanthemum. Nettie was reading the names with her translator specs. Why couldn't they have given the rooms numbers?
We don't even know what ours were called, moaned Lucy.
Ah, cabbage, exclaimed Nettie. This is mine. She gained entry with her pet, personal electronic thingy, and found her upgrade voucher on the last page of her copy of the Supergalactic Traveller magazine, just after the duty-free shopping article. Look, she said to the other two, while you're trying to find your rooms, I'll go and get my upgrade. I've had an idea. She hurried back to the embarkation lobby, trying to ignore the liftbot's account of life on an army pension and no disablement grant. And while the deskbot reluctantly stamped her ticket with her upgrade to second class, she inquired, I suppose the engine room is aft, is it? At the end of the Grand Axial Canal second class, through which you are now entitled to pass. Here is another voucher entitling you to a free glass of moon swill at the bar. The deskbot handed Nettie another ticket and switched itself off. Nettie went as fast as she could, her high heels echoing around the loggia, towards the entrance to the second-class area. Meanwhile, Lucy and Dan were trailing miserably round the Supergalactic Traveller class corridors, looking for any recognisable signs of their cabins. But since every single door and every single inch of corridor were identical to every other door and every other inch of corridor, it seemed a doomed enterprise from the start. They pointed their personal electronic thingies at each door in the vain hope that one would work. What was Nettie's plan? Dan had decided to take their minds off the present hopeless task. She said something about the engine room.
Hey, what's she going to do? Ask the engineer to back up?
Grunted Lucy. Oh, maybe she knows about engines, said Dan.
Nettie, oh, sure, hey. There was a click, I swear.
Lucy tried one of the doors, but it was resolutely shut against them. Well, you know, for one of Nigel's bimbos, that net is pretty bright.
Oh, I didn't realise you were interested in her mind,
replied Lucy. Dan was taken by surprise. What's that supposed to mean?
It's opening,
exclaimed Lucy as one door seemed to give for a moment.
Oh, no, it isn't.
She's a nice girl, said Dan.
Well, you ought to know. You've been ogling her ever since we all had dinner together. God, when was that? It seems like a lifetime ago.
I wasn't ogling her. Dan's injured innocence count was incredibly high some days. Lucy was now working off her frustration.
Anyway, if Ned is so bright, how come she allows Nigel to treat her like a Barbie doll?
Oh, does she?
That sort of woman makes me sick. Why doesn't she stand up for herself?
Well, she still might be quite bright. Dan ventured this without much hope. Lucy's powers of certitude always had a crushing effect on him.
There is no correlation between size of brain and size of breasts,
returned Lucy acidly. Got it! Dan had just pointed his pet at a door, and it had, wonderfully and graciously, swung open for them.
Translator specs.
Lucy rapped out her order to the lampstand, and found the Supergalactic Traveller magazine stuck in a rack alongside a leaflet about aerobics classes, a list of self-operated washing machine facilities on the SGT decks, a 132-page form to register your satisfaction about service on board the Starship, and a small leaflet entitled What to Do in the Event of Fire. Evidently, the recommended action was to stay extremely calm and remain cool at all times. You were advised to stay in your cabins and not to try and contact any of the staff. And once again, you were admonished to remain relaxed and enjoy the remainder of the flight. Do you think it's getting colder? Asked Lucy as she tore out the voucher from the magazine. Anyway, said Dan, I was not ogling Nettie. Nettie shivered as she waited for the door to the second-class area to open. For a brief moment, she wished her Gap t-shirt covered her midriff. But then, as the door opened and she stepped through, her mind was swamped by the sight before her. She found herself standing on the main jetty of the Grand Axial Canal second class. It stretched out in front of her under a simulated sky. Wide columns marked out the elegantly curved walls, and burning braziers dotted the canal embankments. All over the canal, automated gondolas plied lazily back and forth, their robot gondoliers singing pleasantly, a song that brought harmony and peace to the main thoroughfare of the starship Titanic. She gave him love, she swung above, she kissed him on his smiling handsome lip. The gondolier sang in her ear, she gave him 6 pennies as a tip. Nettie climbed into the nearest gondola, and the singing stopped. Take me to the engine room, she said.
See, a workplace chum of Victorious athletics coach,
said the gondolier. and off they drifted down the Grand Axial Canal.
"Tell me," said Nettie, "shouldn't you be singing when you've got a passenger rather than the other way round?" "See, perspicacious lady orthodontist,"
replied the robot, breathing evenly with the exertion of propelling the craft.
"There must be something wrong with the ship's central intelligence system."
Nettie nodded and made a mental note of this. The gondola took us straight down the very middle of the Grand Axial Canal. The pace was relaxed, and the whole ambience so far away from what she ever imagined being on a spaceship to be like, let alone an alien spaceship, that Nettie found herself leaning back against the cushions and letting her mind drift. She wondered why she didn't feel more distressed by her situation. It was almost as if she felt there was some benign presence in the starship, something or someone that she knew would take care of them. Nettie shook her head. The thoughts were all a little too shapeless to make sense. And then what about Nigel? Why didn't she miss him more? For 3 months now, her whole life had revolved around him. She'd made sure his diary was up to date and that he'd looked at it. She'd made him change his socks every day and had washed his underpants by hand. She must love him a lot. And yet she knew he'd just gone out of her life. Not just because they'd been kidnapped by an alien starship full of robots, heavens above. She knew they'd return to Earth. She knew they wouldn't be harmed. But Nigel would not be there for her. Something was broken. And yet she didn't seem to regret it. But she could not, for the life of her, think why. The gondola bumped. They had reached the jetty.
"The gondolier was on his knees, she blew a kiss from her trapeze,"
sang the robot gondolier as soon as Nettie was out of the gondola. "Thanks," said Nettie.
"And that was when the lady lost her grip,"
sang the robot. Nettie adjusted her translator specs and immediately saw a notice which read, "Crew and personnel only." She followed the sign down a stainless steel corridor towards a set of glowing blue doors. As she approached, there was no perceptible engine noise, unless it was that distant rustling of leaves, or was it the beating of a sea upon a distant shore? Nettie felt a thrill pulse through her, and then realized it was just a chill. It really was getting very cold in the ship. And was it her imagination, or was her breathing getting more difficult? At the luminous blue doors, Nettie waved her John Lewis credit card and said in a commanding voice that she had never ever used before, "Special Customs and Excise search warrant. Open up." There was a slight hesitation. The glowing blue doors opened a crack and then shut again, hesitated, and then immediately opened up. The engine room was so similar to the sort of thing you'd see in a science fiction film that Nettie felt she knew exactly where she was. Except, what was that black darkness behind the thick window? There didn't seem to be anything there, and yet all the wiring and so forth seemed to be connected to it. Nettie looked around for the intercom. Her idea had been quite a simple one. If they couldn't get up to the bridge to speak to the captain personally, then she'd telephone him from the engine room. There had to be some sort of communication between the bridge and the engineers. In the corner there was a small cabinet. Maybe that was it. She opened the doors to reveal 2 buttons. One read, "Bomb Monitor," and the other, "Press to Arm." A sudden wave of cold, even colder than the current temperature of the ship, swept through Nettie's body. Bomb? Was there a bomb on board? Nettie pressed the button that read Bomb Monitor. A polite voice said, "Thank you for inquiring about the status of the Mega Scuttler Company's 8D96 Full-Force Mega Scuttler, a bomb to be proud of, which has been installed for your convenience upon this starship. It is my pleasure to inform you that the Mega Scuttler is currently not activated. Thank you for showing an interest in bombs." Whew, bit of a relief, thought Nettie. Now, where's the intercom? What happened next is totally unclear. Certainly Nettie herself had no recollection. She remembered climbing up the ladder next to the armour-plated window. She could recall feeling colder than ever and finding it harder to breathe, and then feeling a force gripping her, a force pulling her sideways off the ladder, a force so vast that she thought she was being sucked into a black hole or something, as she felt herself falling horizontally off the ladder towards whatever it was behind the Perspex window. The next thing she knew, she was whirling round in blackness, fighting for her life. Dan and Lucy were having trouble. They had both procured their vouchers and had successfully wheedled an upgrade to second class out of the deskbot. But the tricky negotiation for an upgrade to first class was proving to be a remarkably harrowing experience. They had had to call on every last reserve of self-esteem and self-worth to withstand the deskbot's withering insolence. You have no credit card, you are not members of the 60 Million Club, you are not even registered frequent travellers. This whole discussion is pointless. You will find the second-class facilities on board this starship more than adequate for your requirements. How could even a robot be so unbelievably, unremittingly snotty, wondered Dan.
Dan, said Lucy, we're wasting our breath. In fact, is it my imagination or is it getting harder to breathe?
Dan sniffed the air. Lucy was right, it was also getting colder. Jesus, he muttered. The air and heating are at normal levels, announced the doorbot.
That's bullshit, snapped Lucy. It's getting colder and it's getting more difficult to breathe.
I can assure you that the air supply and the temperature are set to maximum for supergalactic traveller class comfort, said the doorbot. Are you trying to tell us there are different levels of air supply for the different classes of traveller? Exclaimed Dan. Not normally, sir, no, replied the doorbot. However, should the ship be travelling without first or second class passengers, the oxygen and heating will, naturally, be lowered to the comfort requirements of supergalactic traveller class passengers.
Jesus! Exclaimed Lucy. You guys are the most cynical, amoral travel company I have ever come across.
I'm going straight to the Travel Association when I get home. Dan was not messing about any longer. He was beginning to sweat with panic, despite the cold. There isn't enough air to breathe. There is ample air and heat for the supergalactic traveller decks, sir, but unfortunately it is getting dispersed over the whole ship. Lucy, meanwhile, was back at the deskbot, hammering on the desk.
I'm sorry, madam, the deskbot was saying, but it is company policy to supply first and second class air and heat only if there are first and second class passengers on board. But we're second-class passengers. I have no record of any second-class passengers on board. But you just gave us an upgrade. We have vouchers. Oh, I'm afraid vouchers are not processed until the end of the month. Thank you for your inquiry. The deskbot suddenly turned itself off. All right. Dan was trying to work himself round to decisive mode. Oh, let's get organised. It's vital we all stick together. Go and get Nettie while I try and sort this mess out. Hey, but if I go and get Nettie, we won't all be sticking together. Lucy's rational streak tended to obtrude whenever Dan was in decisive mode. All right, I'll go and get her. No, that's the same thing. Anyway, why are you so worried about Nettie? I'm not. I just think we all ought to keep together in case one of us needs help. Like, what sort of help do we give if we're all running out of air and freezing to death? Lucy was getting quite steamed up, considering the cold. All right, don't go and look for Nettie, but what are we going to do? Dan sounded so desperate, so forlorn, and yet, oddly, Lucy preferred it to decisive mode. I'll see if I can find a supply of oxygen. You do your best here. You must be able to get us up to first class. Hey, but that's still not sticking together, moaned Dan. I never said we should stick together. That was your idea, said Lucy. Then she put her arms round Dan and gave him a big kiss on the cheek. She liked Dan best when he seemed vulnerable. Cheer up, second-class traveller. I'm sure we're going to be all right. And with that she had gone, and Dan suddenly felt terribly alone. So alone, he felt he could pick his loneliness up in his hands and examine it. But even as he did so, he realized it wasn't Lucy's absence that made him feel empty inside. It was something else. Lucy had a good brain, even though she had lived all her life in LA. Despite the continual exposure to carbon monoxide and people from the film industry, she remained smart. She had trained as a lawyer and was well regarded in the firm where she practiced. Her speciality was entertainment law, but she still liked to use that brain of hers, and here was a good opportunity. Now, where would they keep the oxygen equipment? She actually said it aloud as she paced round the loggia at the top of the central well. Got it! Suddenly she knew exactly where to look. God, it was so great to be bright.
She'd always thanked her stars that she hadn't been born a busty bimbo like some people she could think of.
A department store, she told herself. A department store would have a plan of the store by the elevators, so...
And sure enough, there it was, by the elevators, even though this wasn't a department store. She pressed a small button, and a large area of the floor lit up, displaying the plan of the starship Titanic. What's more, she could zoom in and out with a second control. This was better than anything they had at Macy's. Lucy slipped on her translator specs and read, Medical Center. That was where she'd find oxygen. And without waiting to take advantage of any of the special offers the plan of the ship assured second-class passengers they would be delighted with, she made her way to the starship's medical center. The medical center of the starship took up a whole 400-yard section of the main hull, under the embarkation level. It was dazzlingly new and clean, and it said, Hello, and welcome to the medical center of the starship Titanic. A place to enjoy and savor the good things of life while you still have it. Not just somewhere to be sick. We guarantee you will feel no pain once you have placed your credit card in our card care machine. Jesus, thought Lucy, could they do with a new copywriter? Her breathing was all the time becoming a little more difficult, and it was noticeably colder. She looked around for anything that might resemble an oxygen cylinder, and suddenly froze in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Unlike the rest of the ship, the medical center was not unpopulated. There were two people, or were they people? There were two figures on the floor, and one of them was looking straight at her. Lucy stared back. Somehow she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he was not human. He looked human enough, but there was a curious otherness about him. It was intangible, subtle, intriguing. Then she noticed he had the most beautiful orange eyes. Lucy screamed and turned to escape, but the alien had already leapt to its feet, and the door of the medical center had closed behind her. In her panic, she couldn't figure out how to open it again. A powerful arm gripped her round the neck, and a voice that sent a shiver right through her said, "Don't struggle, I can break your neck." Lucy went kind of limp. She always claimed she didn't actually faint, but the journalist, for this is who had his arm around her neck, later said he dragged her over to the nearest bed and laid her out unconscious for several minutes. When Lucy came round, she saw her blood-stained assailant bent over a dead body. She realized immediately he was a crazed killer searching through his victim's clothes. Such odd clothes, Lucy noticed. Strange colours, strange cuts, strange materials. It was at this point that she also realized she was tied down to the bed. The full horror of her situation suddenly hit her like a 40-ton truck hitting a shop window. She was devastated, and her alarm went off. "Ah! Ah! Ah!" screamed Lucy. The journalist looked across at her and clicked his teeth in annoyance. "Shut up," he snarled. Oh my God, the murderer had spoken to her. Here she was, a defenseless woman tied down onto a bed, waiting for this violent sadist to finish rifling the pockets of his last victim, and then come across to her and do what? Do whatever he likes. That's what to her, to Lucy Weber, a graduate of UCLA Law School. Ah! 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 Lucy had never screamed so well or so effectively in her life. Unfortunately, the effect was not to bring Dan running to her rescue, but to attract the unwanted attentions of her murderous assailant. He came across and stared into her eyes. The screams died on her lips as she registered the cruel twist of his mouth, the sadistic glint in those beautiful orange-coloured eyes. The next moment she saw his blood-stained hand move to cover her mouth. "Listen," said the psychopath. "There's a bomb on board this ship. It's going to explode and take us with it unless I can find it quick, so just shut up with the screaming. I can't think and it makes me crazy." God, thought Lucy. It was just like one of those films where the heroine is captured by the serial killer rapist and yet finds herself strangely drawn to him.
What am I thinking about?
Lucy suddenly brought herself up short.
Ah! Ah!
Screaming really seemed the only sensible alternative.
Didn't you hear what I said?
The killer rapist was now glaring into her eyes once again. Lucy felt her bowels go soft with fear, and her breath grew even scarcer than it was.
There is a bomb. I have to find the bomb.
Lucy went quiet and thought about this. A bomb was clearly not good news. The murderer returned to his victim and continued examining his pockets, of which there were rather a lot. Skraliontis had always been an expensive dresser, and you could always reckon on his suits having more pockets than anyone else's, that being the fashion of the day. Suffering supernovae, thought the journalist. I've never seen so many pockets. Why are you doing that? Lucy surprised herself with the steadiness of her voice. I'm looking to see if he's got a plan or anything to show where the bomb is, said the journalist. Why should he have? Asked Lucy. Stop asking questions, stuck the journalist. I just asked why. Because he planted the bomb. Oh, said Lucy, thank you. And then thought, why on earth am I being polite to someone who's just about to kill me? Maybe even rape me first. Or maybe he isn't. Maybe there were mitigating circumstances. Maybe the psychopath wasn't a psychopath. Maybe he was a caring family man with a flair for initiating excitement, who was resourceful in danger and yet prepared to submit to the will of a strong and loving woman. Is that why you killed him? Lucy felt surprisingly childish asking the question. Because he planted the bomb? I didn't kill him. Suddenly Lucy saw the murderer in a new light. For a start, he wasn't a murderer. In the second place, she noticed he was hurt himself. He seemed to be in some pain as he bent over the body. Perhaps he wasn't going to rape or kill her either. Ah-ha-ha! The journalist gave a yell that made Lucy jump. Have you got it? Lucy asked nervously. Shut up, said the journalist. He had a small piece of paper which he was now stuffing into one of his many pockets, although he didn't have nearly as many as Skraliontis. Hey, you can't leave me here! Lucy had gone from abject terror to incensed indignation in less time than most people could go from feeling okay to still feeling okay. I can't waste time, snapped the journalist. It may go off any second, and he made for the door. Don't leave me tied up in here with a dead body! Screamed Lucy. Something in her tone of voice, maybe the sheer volume of it, made the journalist stop. He turned and looked at Lucy in her power pinstripe, tied to the bed, her black hair falling across her face. Shit, he said. The actual Blerontin phrase was north of Pangolin, which was a particularly unpleasant suburb of Blerontis, the capital of Blerontin, but the meaning was shit. He limped over to the bed and untied Lucy. Just don't get in the way, he said. Don't talk to me like that, fired Lucy. Oh, you're going to be a great help, I can see that. And the journalist set off down the corridor towards the stairs up to the embarkation level. Wait, Lucy shouted after him. I've got to find a supply of oxygen. Forget it. But it's getting hard to breathe. Not as hard as it will be once we're tiny fragments floating in space, retorted the journalist. Lucy was by now running alongside him. Hey, you're an alien, aren't you? She suggested, as they waited for the doorbot to open the door to the second-class area. No, replied the journalist, you're the alien. This is a Blerontinian starship, in case you hadn't noticed. Point taken, said Lucy. Dan would never have talked to her like this. Oh, my God! The doors opened and she took in for the first time the majestic sweep of the Grand Axial Canal second class. She plummeted and hit his head and gave him 6 penades as a tip, sang the gondoliers. Oh! The journalist gasped as he stepped down into the nearest gondola and missed his footing. Lucy caught him and held him for a moment. You're hurt, she said. Let's get on, he returned. We've no idea when the bomb is time to go off. Lucy helped him down into the gondola, and the singing stopped. Take us to the engine room, gasped the journalist, holding his stomach. Si, nitrogen loading respecters of pressed veal. And make it fast. Si. The gondola set off down the Grand Canal at no greater speed than any other. Lucy looked across at her former assailant. He was rocking backwards and forwards, hugging himself. Are you cold? Asked Lucy. She certainly was. But the journalist didn't reply. He just gritted his teeth, and Lucy suddenly realized he was in real pain. What happened? She asked, and touched his arm. That bastard, Skraliontis, stabbed me with a table lamp, growled the axe murderer. Lucy stifled a laugh. How can you stab someone with a... It had a sharp end, interrupted the journalist. Are you in pain? Asked Lucy. The journalist grunted. Lucy leaned towards him and moved his hands away from his stomach. The unfamiliar smell of a being from another world caught her unawares. It was not unpleasant, quite the contrary, but it made her head spin. "Leave me alone," he growled. "Let me look at it." Lucy pulled him back onto the pillow and tried to open his clothes, where the congealed blood was thickest. "I have no idea how to undo this," she said. "Thought seal," he said. And suddenly the garment opened, so that Lucy was able to pull it back and reveal the journalist's gouged flesh. "Oh, it's nasty," she said. "Look!" Suddenly she made a quick movement. The journalist yelled, and she pulled a large shard of glass from his abdomen. The blood welled up again from the wound. I couldn't see it," he gasped. "Thanks." And he held up a small packet. "Here," he said. "Oh, thank you," said Lucy. She accepted the gift in what she felt was an appropriately gracious way. "What is it?" "A plaster," said the journalist. "Stick it on before I bleed to death."
Hey, lady, she say we ought to sing while passengers are in the gondola and not other way round,
confided the gondola bot, clearly feeling the need for a bit of small talk.
"We think something may be seriously wrong."
"Just get us to the engine room," gasped the journalist. By the time they reached the engine room, Lucy had managed to convince the journalist that her name really was Lucy. But you know what that means in Blorontin?" The journalist was in some pain from the laughter. He'd managed to stop at last, and Lucy was feeling a bit piqued. "No," she said coldly. "What does it mean?" "I can't tell you," he replied. "I'd like to know." No, I just couldn't." "What's so funny? Go on, you've got to tell me." Maybe when I know you better." Oh, it hurts." "Well, what's your name?" she asked. The journalist," replied the journalist. "That's not a name, that's a job description." The journalist shrugged. "On Blorontin, us news hacks aren't allowed individual names. It's an ancient law, something to do with avoiding the cult of the personality or something." "I can't call you the journalist." "Just call me the," he said, and opened the luminous blue doors of the engine room. A quick look inside drew his attention immediately to the small cabinet in the corner. The journalist strode straight across to it, opened the doors and glanced at the two buttons. Without hesitation, he pressed the one marked Press to Arm. Immediately a flap opened, and a large black steel egg with fins rose up out of the top of the cabinet. At the same time, a voice boomed out, "You have just activated the 8D-96 Full Force Megascuttler, a bomb to be proud of, created especially for you by the Megascuttler Corporation of Dormillion. This will be a fairly big explosion, so please stand well back, about 22,000 miles. Countdown to detonation commencing at once. 1,999, 998, 997. Lucy couldn't believe what she'd just witnessed. She looked at the two buttons again through her translator specs. "Why, for crying out loud, did you press the button that says Press to Arm?" The journalist was hopping around the engine room, kicking himself. "I didn't know it was a Dormillion bomb." "Well, what difference does it make? A bomb's a bomb." I can't explain." "I need to know," insisted Lucy. "No, you don't." He was perfectly right. Lucy herself wondered why she was pressing this point. She grabbed hold of the journalist's shoulders and shook him. "Look, you stupid jerk, you've just done something really stupid, and I have a right to know why." All right." The journalist seemed to be calming down. "It's just that the Dormillion for Press to Arm is very similar to the Blorontin for Please Press Dog. It was just a simple mistranslation. I was wondering what the dog had to do with it." "Great," said Lucy. "So now we really are up shit creek without a bucket." 993, 992, 991, continued the bomb. "What are we going to do?" she yelled. "We're going to keep calm," said the journalist. "Good thinking, snorted Lucy, calling up her not inconsiderable reserves of sarcasm. "You clearly have a mind the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger's humeral ligament. We're running out of oxygen, the temperature's rapidly becoming suitable for an Arctic winter on Pluto, you've just activated what was otherwise a harmless bomb, and now you have the nerve to tell me to stay calm." Who's Arnold Schwarzenegger? Asked the journalist.
Ah!
Lucy decided that a good scream was probably the wisest course of action under the circumstances. The journalist suddenly screamed as well. Lucy stopped her screaming and looked at him. I'm sorry, he said. It's just I can't think when you do that. Lucy felt stupid. I'm sorry too, she said. The journalist smiled and then, for no apparent reason, gave her a kiss on the cheek. Lucy was so surprised to be kissed by an alien, she simply stood there and heard him say, "The clock is counting once every inning. That gives us about 16 Edos before it gets to 0. How long's an inning?" Lucy wanted to say, but her mouth wasn't working. All she could do was stare into those strange and beautiful eyes as she heard him say, "What we must do is find the lifeboats." Dan was still deep in argument with the desk lamp in the embarkation lobby. It was an argument that he had become familiar with over the years of Top 10 travel. But there was something wrong. Somehow he just wasn't getting his points across. This damned desk lamp seemed to be coming out on top every time. Then Dan realized the problem was the air, or rather the lack of air. He just wasn't getting the amount of oxygen into his brain that a travel agent really needs in order to argue for a free upgrade. He was panting and gasping. He was also on his knees and his head was beginning to spin. If you want me to go to the press and blow this story up, I'm quite happy to do so. He knew once you were reduced to this line of attack, the cause was probably lost. They'd never get into first class, they'd never get to the captain, and they'd all die of asphyxiation and cold. Great. At that moment, he heard footsteps running across the loggia of the central well, and an exhausted Lucy, accompanied by a strange man with bright orange eyes, staggered into the embarkation lobby. They collapsed next to Dan and lay there trying to get their breath. "Hey, who's this?" Dan was surprisingly indignant for someone who was in the process of dying of asphyxiation. "Bomb!" gasped the journalist. "You're a bomb?" said Dan. "No!" Lucy felt she had to explain. This is Dan. Dan, this is the..." Dan blinked a few times. "There's a bomb on board. It's about to go off," the journalist managed to get out. "We've got to get to the lifeboats." "They're in first class," explained Lucy. "Naturally." "Now that is outrageous." Dan took this new ammunition and turned on the deskbot. "If I tell the Travel Association that, they'll blacklist your whole fleet forever." Wow, that was some threat. Dan knew they'd had it levelled against the Top 10 Travel Co. Inc. countless times. The deskbot tapped its fingers on the desk and gazed up at the ceiling. "Do you hear?" exclaimed Dan. "I'll close this whole goddamn company down." "Listen, you dumb bot!" The journalist had grabbed the deskbot by its scrawny stand. "This is a matter of life and death. There's a bomb about to go off in..." He checked his watch. "In 10 Edos, Pangolin!" "How long's that?" asked Dan. But the journalist wasn't listening. He was too busy shaking the robot. Suddenly there was a crack and a flash, and all the lights went off for an instant. "Hey!" cried everyone, and the lights came on again, although there was no cause and effect between the shout of "hey" and the recommencement of illumination.
"I'm sorry, there is nothing I can do unless you have a Galactic Gold credit card,"
replied the robot in a simulated strangled voice. "Pangolin," repeated the journalist.
"Please mind your language,"
croaked the despot. "Don't you have a credit card, asked Lucy. She was appalled to think her new friend might not be the most solvent character on Bloontin. "Not a Galactic Gold," he said. "Who is this?" Dan had switched back to indignation mode. "You've got to earn over 7 potatoes a week to get one of those beauties." The journalist was still trying to strangle the deskbot. "It's getting really hard to breathe," choked Lucy. Ice was now forming on the edge of the desk. Dan pointed at it. "You call that supergalactic class comfort?"
"Take your hands off my flex," choked the despot. "You'll short me again."
"Get us into first class now," choked the journalist, "or I'll smash your lampshade." Lucy had collapsed on the floor, and Dan rushed to her. "Hey, where'd you find that guy?" he whispered into her ear. "Save your breath," panted Lucy.
"Ah!"
screamed the deskbot.
"Security!"
"May you rot in Pangolin!" yelled the journalist. It was at that moment that an extraordinary thing happened. Or rather, it was at that moment that an extraordinary thing crawled into the embarkation lobby, across the highly polished floor and up to the deskbot. It was clearly alive, although only just, and it was very old, very, very, very old. It was wizened and blackened. In its twig-like fingers, the creature held a personal electronic thingy. It waved this under the deskbot's nose and croaked in an ancient voice, "Upgrade, all of us!" The deskbot immediately sprang to attention and became perceptibly brighter. "Of course, madam. What a pleasure to welcome you to the first-class facilities of the Starship Titanic. You will find them without equal anywhere in the galaxy. Please go through and have a pleasant trip." There was a hiss of air returning to the cabins and an instant rise in temperature as the ship registered the arrival of 4 first-class passengers. The door to the first-class area swung open, and Dan and Lucy, the journalist and the ancient creature, stepped through into another and even more amazing world. "Nettie!" exclaimed Dan. "My God, you're Nettie! What's happened to you?" But the ancient creature, who Dan had rightly diagnosed as Nettie, couldn't reply. The moment they had passed into the first-class section, she collapsed and lay as if dead. The Gap T-shirt hung around her shrunken frame like an overlarge pullover. Her jewellery looked foolish and ill-advised on her scrawny wrists and neck. What on earth, or off the earth, had happened to her? What had, in fact, happened was this. The Starship Titanic was powered by the latest and most incredible invention of the great Leovinus' genius. No one knew how he had done it, and he had kept it an absolute secret. But somehow he had harnessed for the Starship, his beloved masterpiece, the vastest source of power in the probable universe. A captive black hole. Naturally, something as powerful as a black hole needed very careful handling and had to be surrounded by incredible safety precautions. Unfortunately, safety was one thing that neither Skraliontis nor Bobostigan had first in their minds when they began to reduce the specifications for the construction of the ship.
"There won't be anybody in the engine room,"
explained Skraliontis, when even Bobostigan had queried the wisdom of reducing the incredibly strong glass company's specs for the observation window into the black hole. Bobostigan had not been reassured. "But you know what black holes are like." Actually, Skraliontis didn't. He was an accountant and not an engineer. In any case, black hole technology was a brand new concept straight out of Leovinus' brain.
"Just take Leovinus' lowest parameter for the glass shield," he snapped. "We can't afford any more."
It was Nettie who discovered the problem thus caused by Skraliontis' cost-cutting, as she climbed the ladder looking for the phone to the captain's bridge. The force of the black hole had simply plucked her off the ladder and absorbed her through the incredibly strong glass company's below-spec window. Once in the black hole, she had begun to spin around for, as far as her body was concerned, hundreds of years, travelling millions of light-years round in tiny circles. Fortunately, she still had her personal electronic thingy on her, and this dutifully clocked up all the miles she travelled. Nettie herself didn't know how she had escaped. In fact, she had been thrown clear of the black hole when the journalist had short-circuited the deskbot. Nettie was, miraculously, still alive, and, even more miraculously, still had the presence of mind to realize that she had accumulated millions of light-years of space miles, enough to get them all 3 upgrades to first class. "Less than 8 Eidos to go," exclaimed the journalist. "And that's assuming the bomb doesn't speed up its counting." What can I do about Nettie?" cried Dan, holding the ancient creature pathetically in his arms. "Oh, leave her! We've got to find the lifeboats!" And the journalist was off, running along the embankment of the Grand Axial Canal first class, with Lucy in close pursuit. "Come on, Dan!" she called. "I can't just leave her," Dan yelled back. But they turned a corner and were gone. Dan tried to lift the ancient Nettie up, but even though she was emaciated and shriveled, he was too exhausted to carry her anywhere. "I can't leave you," he murmured, and stroked her hair. And now he looked around and, for the first time, took in the extraordinary vista presented by the Grand Axial Canal first class. If the word posh ever had any meaning, this was it. It was luxury. It was deluxe. It was expensive. It was also redolent with the operatic singing of the gondola bots. He helped to chalk her tightrope walk so that the lovely lady wouldn't slip. Dan had always hated opera. "Now, let's go somewhere quiet," he whispered to Nettie. And he finally lifted her up and staggered into the nearest doorway. Lucy and the journalist had, meanwhile, discovered that the Star-Struck Construction Company, Inc. had not skimped on the signs to the lifeboats first class. There were big, reassuring signs almost everywhere you looked. They were illuminated, and some of them incorporated flashing arrows. Consequently, the two arrived at the lifeboat assembly station in less than a minute. 7 Edos to go, gasped the journalist. As he said this, both he and Lucy discovered that while they hadn't skimped on the signs, the Star-Struck Construction Company, Inc. had economized on the boats themselves. In fact, they had economized completely and utterly on them.
Well, what's the point of providing
Lifeboats, reasoned Scraviontis to an increasingly nervous Bobostigan,
if there aren't going to be any passengers?
"The bastards!" groaned the journalist. "We're done for. We'll be blown to little bits of drifting cosmos in exactly 6 Edos, 45 Inims." The journalist sank to his knees. The fight had gone out of him. He looked so helpless, so forlorn. Lucy couldn't help it. The thought of imminent destruction threw all the usual caution out of her mind. She leapt to a conclusion that she would probably not even have begun to recognize under normal conditions. "Oh, God, I love you!" And before the journalist realized what was happening, Lucy was all over him, kissing his mouth and running her fingers through his hair. "Ow, ouch!" the journalist yelled. "Mind my wound!" I'm sorry, yelled Lucy. "But we've only got 6 Edos left, whatever they are. I've never felt like this for anyone. The moment I set eyes on you, oh God, no one's ever going to know. Nothing matters anymore, but hurry, do something." And she was wrestling with his clothing. "I can't get it off. I told you it's thought sealed." His clothes suddenly pinged open, and the next minute Lucy had flung her pinstriped power suit onto the empty lifeboat ramp. Her fingers ran over the alien's body as she got on top of him. "Oh, God!" she cried, feeling the blood draining down into her lower abdomen like a rush of seagulls onto the last herring. "We've probably only got 5 or whatever those things are left." "Edos!" The journalist tried not to yell out with the pain of his wound. "We've got 5 Edos left. Oh, this is incredible. We don't do it like this on Blorontin." "Why not?" Lucy asked, although she didn't really care. "It's illegal." The journalist was grinning from ear to ear. "We're only allowed snork style, upside down and from above." "Oh, shut up." Lucy was kissing him. "I had to tell you. I had to. I love you. I've always loved you. That's what's been missing. Ah! "Quick!" cried the journalist. They had only 60 Inims before the bomb exploded. Yes. They rolled and kissed each other, oblivious to the cold metal floor of the lifeboat ramp under their naked flesh. "Life is so short." Lucy suddenly grabbed his hand and looked at his watch. It was totally incomprehensible. "What's it say? 30 Inims. Is that all?" Yes, I love you!" cried Lucy. "Oh!" cried the journalist. And the two of them collapsed together as the clock clicked to 0. They lay there waiting for the forever-ending explosion that would terminate their brief affair. But, unlike the two lovers, it didn't come. Lucy was the first to speak. "What's happened?" "I don't know," said the journalist. "I don't know." At the same moment, Nettie suddenly managed to sit up on the couch on which Dan had placed her.
Oh my God! There's only 5 minutes before the bomb goes off.
5 minutes, thought Dan. This is where, in a cheap novel, the couple, confronted by imminent oblivion, would suddenly make passionate love. It was a pity Nettie was now as old as she was.
"You've got to go and talk to it,"
she pleaded. "What?"
"I can't explain, just believe me. It's in the engine room. Hurry!"
"What?" repeated Dan a bit gormlessly.
"Hurry! The engine room, speak to the bomb!"
Dan decided that, while gormlessness had its place in the human repertoire of reactions, now was neither the time nor place for it. He sprinted out of the beauty salon, which was apparently where they were, and ran down the length of the Grand Axial Canal, trying to ignore the inevitable chorus. She threw her arms around his charms and gave him 6 penades as a tip. The first thing Dan saw when he burst into the engine room was a large bomb sticking up out of a cabinet. A friendly sort of voice was booming out. 58, 57, 56, 55, 54. Dan couldn't think what to say. After all, he'd never addressed a bomb before. He didn't have a clue what sort of thing it would be interested in. Hello, he said. 53, 52, hello, 51, 50, replied the bomb genially. Any chance of you not exploding? Dan thought he might as well get straight to the point. No, 48, 47. Dan was not the most imaginative of men. He knew it, Lucy knew it, Nigel had known it. He was dedicated, hard-working, loyal, thorough, all those admirable and desirable things for anybody's partner to be. But leaps of the imagination were not his forte, and yet he had one now. He suddenly knew the one thing that bombs were bound to be interested in. Look, do you really want to do this? He asked. I mean, isn't it a bit self-destructive? 46, 45, 40... Look, I'm just a simple counting and exploding device, and I'm not equipped for philosophical discourse. Please do not speak to me while I'm counting. Damn, now you've made me lose my place. You see? Recommencing countdown. 1,999. 998. Got the sucker, thought Dan. He checked his watch against the bomb's counting. They had about 16 minutes before they needed to talk to it again. He turned and raced back to Nettie. As he ran, the thought of Nettie kept riffling his mind like a gambler's hands riffling a deck of cards. God, she was so intelligent. How had she found out about the bomb's weakness so quickly? The clarity of her intellect made him feel so ordinary and humble. But then he suddenly remembered how she seemed old and shriveled. He must have been seeing things. That couldn't have happened to the beautiful, gorgeous Nettie. And yet it was then that Dan found himself thinking the most curious thought. Of course, it was terrible if something had happened to Nettie, and what had happened to her. But at least now, thought Dan, he might stand a chance of winning her. Lucy was putting her clothes on rather hurriedly. The fact that she and the journalist had not been blown to cosmic dust had severely embarrassed her. In fact, she didn't know where to look. The journalist was regarding her curiously. You do things very differently in your world, he said. Oh? Lucy tried to pretend that everything was perfectly normal. Yes, he said. On Blorontin we have all these absurd rituals we have to go through before having sex. There's a thing called dating, when a young couple go out for evenings together without necessarily going the whole way, as we say. Then there's a thing called the engagement, where rings are exchanged. And finally there's an elaborate ceremony called a wedding, with a cake and bridesmaids and the best man's speech, not to mention the honeymoon. Oh, you wouldn't believe the rigmarole we have to go through in order to make love to each other. I like your Earth way of doing it much better. The bomb might still go off any second, Lucy reminded him. The bomb? Oh, Pangolin, I'd forgotten. The journalist thought-sealed his clothes. As they raced down the Grand Axial Canal second class, they didn't realise that they had missed bumping into Dan on his way back to the beauty salon by exactly a 1/864th of a second, which, by an incredible coincidence, was exactly where the bomb had got to in its countdown when Lucy and the journalist arrived back in the engine room. 864! 863, said the bomb. Why has it only got as far as 863? wondered Lucy. You're beautiful, replied the journalist. Lucy became aware that he was still looking at her in a rather odd way, and she suddenly wished he'd concentrate on the problem in hand. Maybe it doesn't count when we're out of the room, she suggested. She pulled her companion out of the door, but as she started to listen, Lucy suddenly felt the alien's hands around her breasts. "Whoa, Lucy, I can't stop thinking about you," he murmured as he nuzzled her neck. 862, 861, continued the bomb. That was one theory out of the way, thought Lucy, disentangling herself from the journalist's embrace. Back in the room, she stared at the bomb and tried to think. But it was hard with the alien sticking his tongue in her ear and saying he loved her more than anything on his world. "Please, exclaimed Lucy. "Oh, we haven't got time for that now." "Oh, you started it," he reminded her. Once we're roused, us Blerontinian males tend to be very single-minded. I've met your type before, said Lucy, trying to push him away. Oh, just put your hands on my thing again, he was whispering in her ear. Stop it, cried Lucy. What? Replied the bomb. Oh, damn, I thought you were talking to me. Now you've made me lose count. Recommencing countdown. 1,999. Oh, I love you, said the journalist. You're all I've ever dreamed about. That's it, exclaimed Lucy. We've got to keep talking to the bomb. Please put your hand here, said the journalist. Listen, cried Lucy to the bomb. Which baseball team won the World Series in 1997? 997. 990. Oh, now I've told you before about interrupting me while I'm in the middle of a countdown. If you want a bomb you can have a good natter with, we should have got the Mega Scuttler Pro, which has multitasking, speech recognition, and general chattering software, and therefore makes an altogether more expensive bang. As it is, you've got me, and I'm doing my best under increasingly trying circumstances. Recommencing countdown. 1,999. You have the most wonderful skin, moaned the journalist, biting Lucy quite hard on the earlobe. Ouch, cried Lucy. Look, sir, you've got to stay here and keep talking to the bomb while I go up and find the captain's bridge. I can't bear to be separated from you. If you don't stay and talk to the bomb, we're both going to get blown up, she replied. Oh, just bring me off once more, pleaded the journalist. I'll be able to think properly then, honestly. Blerontinian males need to have 2 orgasms before they can think straight. It's well known. Lucy sighed, brushed the alien's hair straight, and wondered what on earth she'd got herself into. While Dan had gone to talk to the bomb, the prematurely aged Nettie had taken the opportunity to look around the room in which she found herself. At first, she thought it must be some sort of torture chamber, or at least an interrogation room. But once she'd put on her translator specs, she realized she was in the ship's hairdressing and beauty parlor. The thumb screws were actually elaborate nail clippers, the electric chairs were highly ergonomic sitting structures, and the individual gas chambers were hairdryers. It was obvious once you read the motto over the doorway. Welcome to the Starship Titanic Beauty Therapy and Hair Creationery. You will leave here lovelier and younger. Nettie put out a wizened finger and pressed the button on the wall beside the couch, which was marked Press for Service. A metal cage on an articulated arm suddenly sprang up over the back of the couch and dangled a few inches in front of her face. At the same time, a large glass case began to descend from the ceiling until both she and the couch were encompassed by it. A reassuring voice then said, "We have assessed your beauty requirements, and whilst recognizing you have a severe problem, we would like to reassure you that there is little that you can wish to be done that we cannot accomplish, thanks to the de-aging and re-beautifying techniques pioneered by Dr. Leovinus in this machine. So lie back and relax whilst we return you to the bloom of youth. Normally our therapy would require a few minutes, but in cases such as yours, a little longer may be necessary. We apologize for the delay." The next moment, the cage fixed itself over her face, and the glass case filled instantly with some purple gas. Nettie was terrified for a second, but then relaxed as the perfumes began to enter her nostrils. Erotic perfumes, exotic perfumes, scents she had never imagined, scents of far away and wonder. At the same time, the feeling on her face was inexpressibly soft and kindly. She lay back and just hoped that Dan had managed to talk to the bomb. Dan hurried back from the engine room to find that Nettie had disappeared. Where he'd left her was a glass case filled with purple gas. "Nettie!" he cried, banging his fists on the glass, but with no effect. He looked all round the thing, but was unable to find any off switch or any way he could prise the thing off her, if indeed Nettie was in there. After nearly 15 minutes of futile effort, he suddenly remembered he'd need to speak to the bomb again, so he rushed back to the engine room as fast as he could. Meanwhile, the journalist was still trying to put his hand back up Lucy's pinstripe power suit skirt. "You see, we're just not used to casual sex," he was assuring her. "Blerontinian women make such a fuss about it. You know, that they want presents and they want to be treated nice and taken out to expensive restaurants and all that sort of crap. To meet a woman like you is just great. Let's do it again." You said twice and you can think straight, objected Lucy, whose mind was focusing on what seemed to her more pressing problems.
Yeah, but a hand job doesn't really count. Anyway, us Blerontinian males will say anything when we're aroused.
63, 62, 61, said the bomb.
Hey, Bomb, just what do you think you're doing?
Lucy suddenly remembered what she was meant to be doing. Pardon? 60, said the bomb.
I said, Bomb, what the hell do you think you're doing?
Oh, don't talk to me, This is a tricky bit. 49, no, 59, 8. Damn, there I go again, losing concentration. It's all your fault. Recommencing countdown. 1,000.
And I'm aroused now, said the journalist.
It was at that moment that Dan burst into the engine room. He found the alien, whom he'd already taken an agreeably violent dislike to, kneeling behind Lucy, apparently rubbing himself up against her back. Lucy shot to her feet. Oh, Dan, thank God you didn't get blown up. 996, said the bomb. Am I interrupting something? Lucy could tell Dan was not in one of his good moods. And oh, we've just discovered how to confuse the bomb. Talk to it, said Dan. Yeah, Nettie found that out. Oh, no, of course, she would. 994, continued the bomb.
Earth's sexuality seems to be very different from Blerontinian, observed the journalist.
Is it really? Dan was sizing the alien up, trying to decide which bit to punch first.
Yes, said the journalist, putting his arms round Lucy's waist. On Blerontin, males get what we call jealous. If one male finds another male fondling his girlfriend, he can even become extremely violent.
Well, it takes all sorts, murmured Dan. He had already decided on the alien's nose as the first point of contact. But before he could swing his powerful right nose jab, Lucy had managed to disengage herself from the amorous the journalist and had run over to Dan.
We got to get off this spaceship as soon as possible. I suggest the here stays and talks to the bomb while we go and find the captain.
But you don't understand, began the journalist. Dan decided to hold back his fist of retribution for the moment. He would save it for another time. I understand only too well. If we don't get the captain to get us back to Earth soon, we'll never get back. And he was off out of the engine room and racing back down the Grand Axial Canal towards the front of the ship.
Look, it was great making love with you, Lucy said to the journalist,
who was now standing behind her and attempting to fondle her breasts again.
But we've got to get back to the real world, our real world.
And she tried to remove his hands from her blouse.
But Blerontinian males cannot just turn off like that, explained the journalist. We need multiple satisfactions before we can return to a state of equilibrium.
Lucy had attended self-defense classes for 2 years, when she had just qualified for the law, and had always slightly regretted the fact that she'd never had the chance to put her skills into practice. Consequently, it was with some satisfaction that she suddenly realized this was such an opportunity. She decided to use the standard response to the amorous alien fondling you from behind assault. It was textbook stuff. She drove her right elbow hard into his stomach. "Oomph!" gasped the journalist. Then she swizzled half round, caught his left wrist, and threw him over her shoulder onto the engine room floor. "Oomph!" grunted the journalist. Lucy spoke to him firmly in her best lawyer-speak. "Now, you stay here and keep talking to that bomb, while I go and find the captain." Then she was off out of the door, racing after Dan. "You don't understand," the journalist called after her. "There isn't any captain on this ship." But Lucy had gone. 970, said the bomb. "You don't know what you're doing," yelled the journalist. "You're going to need me." "Pardon?" replied the bomb. "I wasn't talking to you." "Oh, damn," said the bomb. "Recommencing countdown." 1,999. By the time Lucy caught up with Dan, he'd already found his way onto the captain's bridge of the starship Titanic. The main feature of the bridge was, as the journalist had tried to point out to them, the distinct lack of anyone or anything who could, in any shape or form, be referred to as captain. In fact, there was a distinct lack in any shape or form of anyone at all. "Jesus, what do we do now?" murmured Dan, as Lucy clutched onto his arm. Along the length of the bridge was a row of windows showing the great black immensity of space and the dazzling arm of the Milky Way along which they were headed.
On the console beneath the windows were various display screens with associated controls. The first screen showed a series of random blocks falling from the top of the screen to the bottom. The second appeared to be some sort of racing track. A third was a shoot-'em-up, and the next one along was a game apparently based on the starship itself.
Hey, they're all video games!
Lucy felt righteously indignant.
They aren't controls at all.
As a matter of fact, the entire Captain's Bridge was little more than a high-class amusement arcade. It had been designed specifically to keep the captain of the starship Titanic amused during the tedium of long intergalactic flights in a spacecraft that was almost entirely automated and self-running. It was, after all, Titania, at the heart of the ship's intelligence, who was far more capable of taking decisions and issuing orders than any mere living creature.
So, said Dan.
So, said Lucy, I suppose we'd better find out how to fly this baby ourselves and point her earthwards.
So, what was going on between you and that thing?
He's not a thing, he's just a perfectly ordinary alien, and there was nothing going on.
He had his hands on your breasts.
No, he did not.
Lucy couldn't stand Dan at moments like this.
Why couldn't he give her room? Why did he try and twist everything? What mattered was them, Lucy and Dan.
What matters is us, said Lucy, taking her cue from the previous sentence.
You and me and any other life form you can get off with.
Oh, Jesus, Dan, you're so unpleasant.
I'm merely stating the facts.
Well, if you really want to know the facts, I never made love to Jürgen Zenzendorf.
I wasn't talking about Jürgen Zenzendorf.
Trust Lucy, thought Dan, to bring up another case that she could defend, instead of the one they were actually talking about.
I never even suspected you of going to bed with Jürgen Zenzendorf. I mean, Jürgen Zenzendorf was an asshole.
He was not. That's typical of you to denigrate my friends just because you are unbelievably, maniacally jealous.
Lucy was firing on all cylinders. Dan beat a hasty retreat.
Okay, I accept what you say about Jürgen. He was a nice guy. I liked him. I liked his moth collection. I liked his mother. Jürgen was great.
Or Jimmy Clark.
Ah, now I know you're lying.
How can you say that?
Jimmy Clark told me himself you'd been to bed together.
He's a lying bastard.
Anyway, that was before I knew you. I don't want to talk about any of this.
Then why'd you start it?
Lucy was now yelling at the top of her voice. Dan found his drive to do whatever it was he'd previously felt driven to do shrivel into a limp rag of confusion. He'd actually forgotten what they'd started arguing about.
Oh, Dan.
Lucy threw her arms round him.
Why are you always so far away?
I'm here, Lucy.
But I never seem to get through to you. I love you.
And I love you,
replied Dan, and he kissed her, and she felt how far away he really was.
Oh, Dan, let's get married.
Oh, sure. We're on an alien spaceship, God knows how many light years from Earth, and you want to organize a wedding.
Oh, you know what I mean, she said.
It's no good rushing these things.
Dan, we've been living together for 13 years. We can't ever rush anything now.
Let's get the hotel up and running, and then we can talk about it, said Dan sensibly.
You do like the rectory?
Of course I do. I'm crazy about it.
Except that it doesn't exist anymore.
We'll get it rebuilt. Nigel got a great deal on selling off Top 10 Travel. We'll rebuild it, better than it was, and make it the best little hotel in the goddamn world.
If we ever get back.
Ah, if we ever get back, agreed Dan.
They looked round at the so-called Captain's Bridge, with its library, its video collection, its chessboards and card tables, its jacuzzi, billiard tables, cinema complex and gym, and they wondered how the hell they were ever going to find out how to control something that didn't appear to have any controls in the first place.
Lucy, said Dan.
Oh, don't start again. He wasn't doing anything.
I wasn't talking about that, replied Dan.
Good, retorted Lucy. 1 point scored.
You know this video game that seems to be based on the starship itself?
Uh-huh. Lucy was staring out of the windows above the console of games.
Well, it's sort of changing.
I know this is stupid, said Lucy, but you don't suppose that computer game isn't a computer game?
You mean it might be an actual display showing those things coming towards us?
By now, Dan was also looking out of the window. A squadron of small, clumsy-looking spacecraft were hurtling towards the starship. Dan checked.
Their movements correlated exactly to the motion of the spacecraft on the video display. "Oh my God," murmured Lucy. "We're being attacked." At that moment, the journalist suddenly burst onto the captain's bridge. "The ship's on automatic," he panted, "but the Central Intelligence Corps is missing some of its parts. We can't control the ship unless we can locate all the missing bits of the system and get them back into place." "Too late," said Lucy, and nodded out of the window. The starship was now entirely surrounded by the smaller spacecraft. The journalist muttered, "Holy pangolin!" A voice suddenly boomed over the ship's loudspeaker system. "You are surrounded. Give up at once, or we open fire." "Quick!" yelled Dan, pushing the journalist over to the console. How do we give up at once?" "I haven't the slightest idea," returned the journalist. "If you refuse to give up, we shall open fire in 30 inims," said the voice from the enemy space fleet. "We give up!" yelled Lucy. But her voice merely echoed round the captain's bridge. "Do something!" screamed Dan. "I told you, the ship's missing essential bits. I don't know what to do." The journalist was flipping controls as fast as he could, but to little effect. "Since you refuse to cooperate," boomed the voice.
"We'll cooperate, just give us a chance!"
Lucy had climbed onto the console and was waving her arms at the spaceships in a desperate attempt to attract their attention. "You give us no choice but to open fire." The space outside the starship suddenly exploded in light, and a terrific noise battered the mighty hull, deafening those inside. Lucy fell off the console, and Dan and the journalist both dived to the floor, where they lay trembling with their hands over their ears. There was then a pause. The voice boomed over the loudspeaker again. "Do you surrender?"
Yes, we surrender!" screamed all three occupants of the captain's bridge.
"Very well, you leave us no choice." Another almighty din broke out around the starship, and this time they could feel it shudder with the impact of the explosions outside. Then there was silence. The smaller spacecraft edged in a little closer. Then the voice was booming out again. "Look, we don't want to damage the starship, but if you refuse to cooperate, you'll leave us no choice." The journalist had by this time found a sort of microphone. He pushed a switch and bellowed into it.
Stop! Stop! We surrender! Stop!"
His voice boomed out all over the starship Titanic. There was a terrible silence. Then they heard the enemy for the last time. "We shall hold you responsible for any damage done to the starship." With that, a wave of the smaller spacecraft peeled off from the main fleet and swooped towards the starship. Points of light spattered out from their guns, and the sound of ripping metal shook the great starship.
"Oh, my God!"
screamed Lucy. None of them could have told you how long the attack went on for, but it seemed like several lifetimes to the three figures huddled on the captain's bridge. The noise, the vibration, the crashing and bucking of the giant starship went on and on. Lucy found the journalist had his hands on her breasts, but decided not to say anything. When it was all over, they waited and then stood up, trembling and shaking. The first wave was returning to the main fleet. Meanwhile, a second wave was peeling off. "Here they come again," yelled Dan. And he and Lucy ducked down once more beneath the console. But the journalist remained standing with a curious expression on his face. Lucy and Dan braced themselves for the gunfire, but it didn't come. Instead, there was an odd, rather unmartial banging on the hull of the ship. "Yassicans," muttered the journalist. Lucy and Dan both assumed this was another alien expletive and remained under cover. But then the journalist nudged Dan and said, "Look." Dan cautiously put his head above the console and peered out of the window. The second wave of spaceships had pulled up all around the starship, and an army of short and stocky, space-suited figures was swarming over the hull, hammering and welding as they went. "What the blazes?" asked Dan. "They're repairing the damage," explained the journalist. "Yassicans are like that. They hate injuring hardware." "And what about software?" asked Lucy, readjusting her bra. "We'll need guns," yelled the journalist. "Follow me." The three of them ran doubled up out of the captain's bridge, while the enemies, hammering and welding outside, gathered in intensity. Meanwhile, the voice boomed out over the loudspeakers again. "We shall recommence our attack as soon as the first damage has been repaired. If you do not surrender, we shall board and dispose of everyone we find." In the crew's quarters, the journalist discovered an arms cache. He handed out weapons to Dan and Lucy. How do we use them? Asked Dan, turning a strange gun over in his hand. It had a short thingy and bulbous side thingies and a sort of thingy that stuck out and which Dan pushed. A laser beam shot across the crew room and exploded in a fireball at the other end. Like that, explained the journalist, except don't point them at the soft furnishings. He rushed over to the flaming curtain that Dan had just set on fire and grabbed an extinguisher.
Hey, we can't use these,
cried Lucy. Then you'll just have to get used to the idea of being thrown off the ship into deep space. These Yasigans are not playing games. Here, Dan, put this on. He threw Dan a helmet. What is it? Asked Dan. The starship has two realities, explained the journalist. One is the data side, and the other is the matter side. When the Yasigans board, they'll try to take over the data side as well as the matter side. So one of us better be prepared to confront them there. I've no clue what you're talking about, replied Dan. It's a VR helmet, a virtual reality helmet. You put it on, you'll be able to explore the data side and check whatever the Yasigans get up to there. The journalist was clearly losing patience.
I'll just put it on, shouted Lucy.
The noise from the repairs on the hull was getting unbearable. What the heck are they doing out there? Exclaimed Dan. Just put on the helmet, cried Lucy, at which Dan did. Oh, wow, he exclaimed. I see what you mean. I'm right in the ship. Hey, this is great. I can get into the consoles. Wow, now I'm running along the wiring. Hey, the circuit boards are like vast cities. Oh, shit. The moment he had the helmet on, the journalist grabbed Lucy and started kissing her as if there was no tomorrow, which he figured might well be the case. And as if she'd been expecting this all along, Lucy started to kiss him. But then she suddenly pulled back and glanced anxiously over at Dan, who was climbing some invisible stairs in his virtual reality, and then turning around and handling invisible objects and letting out delighted yelps.
Oh, don't worry about him, panted the journalist. He can't hear or see us. We're still matter side. He'll be totally absorbed in that thing. It's always the same. First time you put on one of those, you're usually off for 5 or 6 hours. Let's do it. But still Lucy pushed him away. But what about the Yasigans? She protested. They're invading the ship. That's right. We've hardly got time to do it before they arrived. Quick! Is that all you can think about? Groaned Lucy. The journalist was now nuzzling her neck and sending excited shivers down her spine. I told you, once we Blerontinian males get aroused. Ah! Lucy suddenly screamed. And what about the bomb? Oh, Pangolin, exclaimed the journalist. I'd forgotten about that. He suddenly whipped a small handset out of one of his many pockets and flipped it on. 25, 24, 23, the bomb was counting. Toothless rabbits, yelled the journalist. It's nearly there. 22, said the bomb. Hey, bomb, yelled the journalist into the phone. Oh, don't talk to me, moaned the bomb. I'm nearly there. 23. No, I've done that. We're being invaded, shouted the journalist. 20, oh no, oh damn. Oh, recommencing countdown. 1,000. The journalist flipped the phone off and started kissing Lucy's neck and undoing her suit. Whew, that was close, he breathed. Whoops, nearly went down a transistor then, said Dan. And suddenly Lucy was running her hands all over the journalist and pulling him down onto the floor. You're crazy, she murmured. The hammering and banging on the outside of the ship had stopped by the time Lucy and the journalist had struggled back into their clothes. Dan, who was still scrambling around some unseen obstacles on the data side, suddenly yelled out, They're in the ship! The journalist grabbed as many weapons as he could carry and headed out of the crew room. Down at the far end of the Grand Axial Canal, he could see short, stocky figures already slipping onto the jetty. The journalist settled himself behind a large podium on which one of the braziers burnt and took aim. As Lucy joined him, he fired, and a series of explosions rocked the jetty and sent the invaders diving for cover. The next moment, Lucy felt the air around and above her exploding with light and noise as the Yasigans returned their fire. Hey, this air duct goes on forever! Lucy span round to see that Dan, still in the VR helmet and totally unconscious of anything that was happening matterside, had wandered out through the open door of the crew room and was now heading straight for the Grand Axial Canal. Dan, she screamed, and ran towards him as his feet reached the edge of the embankment. Immediately there was another explosion of noise and light around them as the Yasigans fired again. But Lucy had hold of Dan's sleeve. She managed to twist him round on the very edge of the water and pushed him back towards the crew room. The journalist, meanwhile, was firing as fast as he could in the general direction of the invaders.
But by now there was so much smoke neither side could see very much. "Let's get out of here," yelled the journalist, and he bundled Lucy after Dan back into the crew room. "Who set fire to the curtains?" demanded Bolfast the moment he burst into the crew room. He nodded, and a couple of Yassican repair workers hurried over to replace them. Bolfast had led his special assault group along a back service corridor to the crew's quarters, while Yellin and Asmal led the frontal attack along the main arteries of the starship. Bolfast loved the finish they had obtained on the service corridor ceiling. It gave him much quiet satisfaction in the dark of the night to reflect on the craftsmanship and the high quality of material lavished on even the working areas of the great starship. "Never was there another such construction in the entire history of our people," he used to tell his grandchildren, as they sat around the evening hearth eating their dumpling stew and Snork crackling. "Even the curtains in the crew rooms were woven from the hair of the silky Canadil, which lives high up in the mountains of Merlor and can only be caught with love and kindness. The hair of the Canadil is so fine you must only weave it by the light of the moons, for in sunlight it will disappear like snow." The children loved these tales of craftsmanship and daring feats of engineering. It cut Bolfast to the quick to see how someone could mistreat such soft furnishings. In fact, it made him very cross indeed. At that very moment, a figure wearing a VR helmet stumbled into the room, followed by two others, one of whom was clearly a treacherous Blerontinian. A black rage swallowed Bolfast whole, and the next moment he had swiveled out his SD handgun and blasted the three newcomers to cosmic dust. Their bodies exploded in a supernova of entrails and mangled flesh that quickly reached white heat and, happily, burnt out before they could besmatter or stain the beautifully hand-lacquered walls. Lucy was aware of a violent cacophony of noise, and her eyes were whited out by the most piercing light. She screamed, grabbed onto the journalist, and fell in a faint upon the floor. It was that terrifying. Bolfast grinned and blew away the smoke from his SD handgun. His anger assuaged, he twirled the gun on his finger and slipped it back into its holster. It has to be explained at this point that the Yassicans were a peace-loving, kindly race, dedicated to craftsmanship and sober industry. Many of them, however, were also prone to blind, bloodlusting rage when confronted by certain things, such as a disregard for fine workmanship. In the distant past, these rages had led to terrible destruction of life and property, and since the moods went as quickly as they came, they had also led to unendurable remorse for many thousands of these otherwise benign and caring folk. The Yassican scientists had, therefore, developed the SD weapon, which, unlike the sort of hardware that most military scientists come up with, was designed to reduce death and destruction rather than increase it. The Simulated Destruction Weapon, or SD gun, gave the user the momentary impression of having wreaked the bloody revenge that his crazed fury craved, without actually doing any damage. It always surprised and stunned the enemy, but that was all. Lucy, not knowing any of this, was more than astonished to find herself still alive enough to hear the leader of the invaders demand, "You are under arrest. Where are the others?" "Hey, this is great. I'm going down one of the cybernautic neural pathways. It's like a water slide. Way excellent!" exclaimed Dan. "Take that stupid thing off his head," snapped Bolfast. The Yassicans had no time for virtual reality exercises. Their business was exclusively matter-side. Two of the invaders grabbed Dan and yanked the helmet off his head. "Hey, I was enjoying that! Jeepers, what's going on?" said Dan, as he experienced SRM, sudden return to matter-side. "I said, where are the others?" repeated Bolfast. "There aren't any others," replied the journalist truculently. "Come on, I wasn't brought up in a Blerontinian state nursery. Who's running this ship?" Blerontinian state nurseries were infamous for turning out individuals of less than average mental agility, possibly owing to the fact that, for generations, Blerontinian governments had saved money on these establishments by forbidding any teaching to be done in them. Bolfast was getting irritated again. He'd just noticed the wretched finish on the mess tables. It totally let down the high standards set by his own workmen on the other fittings in the crew room. Whoever had supplied the tables had used unseasoned Linton pine from northern Blerontin, an inferior wood which would warp badly after a couple of decades in use. And, by the falls of Faknik, They hadn't even concealed the end grain with house joints. In fact, when he looked closer, he could see the tenons were barely haunched, leaving scarcely enough timber at the top of the stile for wedging. Had these people never learned even the most rudimentary basics of the art of joinery? Bolfas reached for his SD gun. But before he could wreak his terrible and destructive revenge on the perpetrators of this slipshod botchwork, a miracle happened. The door of the crew room opened, and a vision entered. Someone so compellingly and so unutterably beautiful that Bolfas fell heavily and permanently in love. His life was never to be the same from that moment forth. He lowered the SD gun and stared in childlike adoration. Nettie, who had just completed her course of rejuvenation in Leovinus's extraordinary beauty parlour, had not only regained her youthful complexion, her body had also returned to its former proportions. In fact, if anything, her waist was just that little bit thinner, her breasts just a tiny bit firmer, the swell of her stomach just a tad more rounded. She looked more lovely than ever, for despite the fresh bloom of youth that had returned to her cheeks, her face was also suffused with the wisdom that comes of having lived for several million light-years. Old Leovinus certainly knew what he was doing. "Nettie," murmured Dan. "Who do you say?" asked Bolfas absent-mindedly. "Hi, everybody," said Nettie. "Supposing we all introduce ourselves. I'm Nettie." "Captain Bolfas at your service," said Bolfas, springing to attention. "And these are Corporals Yarktak, Edimbop, Ragulitin, Dezembo, Luntparga, Forzap, Kakit, Zimwidi, Dutaprat, Kazintinka Rigipittle, Persian Hacken, Roof Cleetop, Spangler Widden, Buke Hammerdorf, Bunsley Water, Brudelhampton, Harsey Waddle, Unktimpota, Gol Hollywell, Dinsey Newt, Tiddleoff, Cosimiwit, One Crocodile, Urkel Hameldrat, Inchby Wiglet, Samuel Liftoff, Buke Willie Nudgett, he's a half-cousin by marriage of Buke Hammerdorf. "Hi, Nettie," said one of the Yassican invaders. "Barnes Apute," continued Bolfas, "Spig Halliwiller, Memsiportim, Itkip, Harlaw Freighter, Pulligit, Beekelmensdork, Appelsaftat, Buckhamster, Rintin Eaglebun, Bootintuck, Poodle Asvan, Subcretor Cattlebird." "Look, I hate to interrupted the journalist, but there's a bomb on board this ship which is about to go off in—" He switched on the mobile phone. 10, 9, counted the bomb. "Hot pangolin!" exclaimed the journalist. "Silence, Blerontinian purveyor of shoddy goods!" shouted Bolfas, grabbing the mobile phone. "He's not a purveyor of shoddy goods!" exclaimed Lucy, who, if the truth were told, was a bit hacked off by the reaction to Nettie's entrance. 8, said the bomb. "Give me that!" screamed the journalist, flinging himself at the phone. Bolfas tossed it to Corporal Inchby Wiglet. 7, counted the bomb. "It's down to 7, yelled the journalist. "Take this Blerontinian bodger to the cells," commanded Bolfas. Corporals Spangler Widden and Rintin Eaglebun grabbed the journalist in a half-Nelson and marched him out of the crew room. 6, said the bomb, and Corporal Inchby Wiglet flicked the mobile phone off. "These two as well." Bolfas was pointing at Lucy and Dan. "No!" cried Lucy and Dan. "The bomb!" But they were hustled out. "Captain Bolfas," said Nettie in a cool voice, "there is no time to explain. Please give me the phone." "I am afraid I cannot allow you to use it, Nettie," said Captain Bolfas, "for security reasons." "Such as?" "You might call for reinforcements." "Captain Bolfas, you have my word that there is no one else on this ship as far as I know. You also have my word that there is a bomb about to blow us all to cosmic dust unless you give me that phone." Bolfas hesitated for a fraction of a second and then nodded to Corporal Inchby Wiglet. Corporal Inchby Wiglet hesitated even less than a fraction of a second and handed the phone to Nettie. Nettie switched it on. 2, said the bomb. "Oh, bomb," said Nettie. "This is Nettie, remember me?" 1, said the bomb. "How many 4s make 8? No, how many 4s make 8? 2, said the bomb. "How many 2s in 6? 3, said the bomb. "And how many times does 3 go into 12? 4, said the bomb. It paused for a moment and then continued. 5, 6, 7. "Phew," said Nettie, "that'll buy a bit of time." "Why have you put this bomb onto our ship?" demanded Bolfas. "Your ship?" exclaimed Nettie. "Why do you sound so surprised?" cried Bolfas. "Do you think we're not smart enough to have built such a wonderful thing?"
"Oh, no," replied Nettie. "I didn't mean anything like that. It's just that you attacked the ship. It didn't seem like you owned it."
"Of course we own it."
Nettie thought Captain Bolfas appeared a trifle defensive.
"Legally and morally, this ship is our rightful recompense for all the misery and hardships that we have suffered at the hands of the Blerontinians."
"Look, I don't want to appear stupid."
"Oh, you could never look that, Nettie," the captain assured her.
"Well, thank you." Nettie felt herself charmed by this short, fair stranger, in whose hands her fate apparently lay. "But I don't know the background history to all this."
"And I will be delighted to tell you the whole story, dear lady."
Bolfas gave her a deep bow.
"But first it is my unpleasant task to ask you once again, why have you placed a bomb on this ship?"
"We haven't." Nettie gave a little laugh that sent the captain's heart reeling after his wobbly knees. "We're on this ship by accident." And she told Bolfas the whole story. How Dan and Lucy were about to turn the old rectory into a hotel, with the money from the Top 10 travel agency, and how the starship had crashed into the house, how they had been invited aboard by a polite robot, and of all the things that had passed on the ship, up until the invasion by the good captain's forces. When she had finished, there was a long pause, until Nettie eventually added, "And that's it, really?" Bolfas seemed to suddenly recollect himself, as if he'd